Howdy, howdy. How are we doing? I am still not ready to start this. All right, well, hello guys. What's up? What's up with you all? Shit. Okay, there we go. So now I can hear myself. Hello from England. Oh, hello, Thomas. It's great that you're here because we're actually going to react to English history. I am having dinner. It's probably late in England, isn't it? Right here is like 6 p.m., so it's actually pretty nice. I mean, yeah, I imagine it's like, what, like 2 a.m.? Okay, we're gonna be starting real soon because I'm hungry and I am gonna be having dinner. I hope that you don't mind. Let's see. Let me know if you guys like this position of the camera and the mic. I think I like it a lot. But okay, it's about 12:30. Yeah, okay, so it's not as late as I thought, but it's still pretty late. Was watching a reaction here, and oh shit. Come on, I want to have dinner. Shit. Okay, well, at least you guys can see my screen right now, which is pretty neat, I think. Gosh, man, streaming is hard. You can just like upload YouTube videos, and like that is okay. That's actually pretty fine. Anyway, now you can watch my screen. Great. Let's fix the cam a little bit. There we go. I think that looks good. And there we go. Oh, shit. Okay, perfect. I think that looks good. No, it doesn't. Yeah, there we go. So English history from the YouTube. I was watching something else. Sorry. History matters because we binge watched a lot of his videos on the last live stream, but I actually wanted to look at this playlist that it's actually quite big. It's 20 videos. They are 10 minutes. 55. Okay, and these are like so 10-minute videos, and these are all about English history, which is pretty sweet. I have a lot of viewers that are from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so I figure out, you know what, I think it'd be cool. And I'm having dinner. I'm having nothing English, unfortunately, but it's a few mozzarella sticks and some meat. I don't know how you would call this, but it's not steak. I don't have that money, but just like regular ass meat. Hola, hola, ¿cómo están? Un saludo para todos mis viewers en español. And if you guys don't mind, I think we can start. And yeah, like I said, so I hope that you guys don't mind the having dinner thing. Let's go. 10-minute English and British history. Early Roman Britain and Boudicca's rebellion. Oh, Boudicca? I don't know how to pronounce this. What happened before the Romans? I'm not entirely sure, but I guess we'll figure out, huh?
5 BC, and Julius Caesar has just arrived.
Carne asada. Yeah, sí, es carne asada.
He did this shortly after his conquest of Gaul, which was here. He likely did so because of the close ties between the inhabitants of Britain, known then as Britannia, and those of Gaul. Many of the Gauls who resisted Caesar had alliances and kinship ties in Britain, and some Gallic leaders fled across the Channel whilst others received military assistance. Caesar's first landing did not achieve much, but he landed again next year, and after some conflict he secured the surrender of some British tribes and was able to exact a yearly tribute as well.
Okay, so they were just
the
like
people
tribes?
who lived in Britain at this time are often referred to as Celts. This term isn't particularly useful since it implies a level of homogeneity which simply didn't exist. The inhabitants of Britain certainly spoke a Celtic language, but to say that they were thus all Celtic would be like calling English speakers Germans, since English is a Germanic language.
Yeah, that's true.
These people were divided into tribes and small kingdoms, such as the Trinovantes, who lived here and were Roman puppets. That said, Celts or Britons are commonly used terms, and for the sake of simplicity, their use is warranted. But just remember it's more complicated.
Time to watch the English get stunned by every power that it was able to use a boat.
World, if only barely. Romans were now much more aware of Britain, since before Caesar it had been seen as a near-mythical place which was an ocean away. So, over the next century, a fair few changes underwent the Roman Republic. First, Caesar became dictator for life and was subsequently murdered, thus bringing about the civil war which would see his adopted son Octavian become the first emperor of Rome, the Emperor Augustus. Augustus and his heirs had eyed Britain for invasion over the following half-century, but it was always sidelined due to more pressing concerns. This didn't change until Cunobelinus, the king of the Cativaloni tribe, had conquered the Trinovantes and expelled his son. Cunobelinus' son fled to the Roman Emperor Gaius, better known as Caligula, and declared the submission of Britain. Caligula prepared an invasion force, but at the last minute called it off shortly before being murdered. His uncle Claudius became emperor, and in order to cement his reputation with the people and often rebellious legions, he decided to conquer Britain and achieve that which his predecessors could not. In 43 AD, 4 Roman legions, led by a certain Aulus Plautius and their auxiliaries, arrived in Britain, about 40,000 men in total, and began the process of conquering the south. The British natives attempted to resist, but in battle they lacked the heavy armour or the professionalism of the Roman legionaries. That said, the native British resisted fiercely, and after 4 years Rome had control over this much of the island. Some, such as Cogidubnus, who ruled over this area, and Prasutagus, who ruled the Iceni, who lived here, were allied to the Romans and helped them administer the population in return for prestige, wealth, and not having all of their stuff taken. To the north of the Roman territory sat another client state, the Brigantes, who were led by the Queen
That's how a lot of people felt about the Romans.
For protecting the empire's northern border from raiders. The lands conquered by Rome were governed by 2 administrators. The first was the governor, who was in charge of military and judicial matters, and the second was the procurator, who was in charge of economic ones. Both reported directly to the emperor and were supposed to act as checks on each other's ambitions and power. The province was run from Camulodunum, now called Colchester, and was permanently garrisoned by a legion. Rome slowly but surely consolidated its hold upon southern Britain, but still had to contend with the raids from the west and the north. In response to raiding in the year 47, the Roman government made sure to disarm all of their British subjects,
dude, you hate the British.
The law of the entire empire.
Why not give Belize to Mexico, dude?
Crushed. Importantly, around this time was the founding of Londinium, later London.
I mean, I've always
large-scale urbanization.
I've always wanted a Mexican invasion of Guatemala and Belize, anyways. But
beginning of a coin-based economy, as opposed to the barter economy that had preceded it. Camulodunum ballooned in population, as well as becoming a very important Roman cultural centre. The natives who lived under Roman rule were subject to taxation and conscription, as well as discrimination. These issues eventually led to revolt in the year 60. The main catalyst for the revolt was the death of Prasutagus, who in his will gave half of his kingdom to the new Emperor Nero, and the other half to his 2 daughters. The Romans ignored this and took everything. The wife of Prasutagus, Boudica, protested this, and in return she was flogged and her daughters were raped. After this, Boudica raised the Icenian revolt and was soon after joined by the Trinovantes. They subsequently roamed southern Britannia, burning settlements.
What was that, man? Like, does she have tattoos, or...?
After joined by the Trinovantes. They subsequently roamed southern Britannia, burning settlements such as Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, now called St. Albans. Eventually, Boudicca clashed with the governor of Britannia, Suetonius Paulinus, at what is known as the Battle for Watling Street. The Romans of the 14th Legion were heavily outnumbered, but their better organisation, tactics and equipment gave them victory. Having lost, Boudicca committed suicide, and after his victory, Suetonius went on a spree of punitive expedition to destroy any remnant of resistance to Roman rule.
I mean, the Roman had extremely modern for the time war tactics. I mean, that was what, the Roman army was what conquered the territory. It was made the Roman Empire great.
The new procurator,
and hey, they made it all the way to England.
That this policy of murdering everyone would cause more revolt, and so the Emperor Nero recalled Suetonius to Rome and replaced him with a more tactful governor. The scars of the revolt began to heal over the next decade, with Londinium and Camulodunum being rebuilt. This process was cut short in the year 68 when crisis struck the Roman Empire.
Oh shit! Oh shit! We have some controversial stuff here. You stole, annexed Chiapas. Okay, so for the ones who don't know, Chiapas is a southern state in Mexico. And we did kind of stole it, let's be honest. But you guys can have it back. Chiapas has always mean trouble for Mexico, so you guys can have it back. I had to check that we didn't actually still hold into Belize. Low. Yeah, I know. I still had that doubt not so long ago. I was like, if we invaded Belize, would that cause, trouble with the United Kingdom? Because, we don't want to be the next Argentina, though, so...
Largely useless, was declared an enemy of Rome and subsequently offed himself. The next year, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, because shockingly,
it's crazy to think that Mexico and the UK had a border.
The empire into chaos. Whilst the empire fell into said crisis, the Brigantes' territory collapsed and Roman Britain's northern border was subject to intense raiding. The chaos was put to an end when Vespasian won the civil war and reunited the empire.
I guess that northern border would always cause trouble, huh?
Flavians. The return of stability meant that Rome could now respond to the raids from the north, as well as consolidating their hold over Britain. In the late 70s, Rome was able to expand its control over the island, in part due to a man called Agricola, who was appointed governor of Britannia in 77. He led several expeditions. The first was to crush the Brigantes, and after that he even advanced well into Caledonia, winning a major victory over the Caledonians at the Battle of Mons Graupius.
Oh, wow.
Thus, most of Britain was under Roman control, but after Agricola was recalled to Rome in 85, Caledonia swiftly broke away from Roman influence. So, the incorporation of Britannia was achieved via urbanization and the desire of native British elites to become Roman. The public baths the Romans built meant that those who used them could distinguish themselves from the unwashed barbarians from outside the empire. The newly introduced Roman and Greek literary classics could be read to show off one's intelligence. The new luxury goods imported from the rest of the empire were a means of showing off wealth as well. It was through this cultural
for a long time, Boudicca is seen and still seen by some as a British hero. That's interesting, it makes sense.
This did not mean that Romanized natives were somehow seen as equals by Romans, and one such attitude is displayed by the writer Tacitus, who was Agricola's son-in-law, and is one of the major sources for early Roman Britain. He says that within the British a liking sprang up for our style of dress, and the toga became fashionable. All this, in their ignorance, they called civilization, when it was but a part of their servitude. One way of measuring just how Roman the British natives had become is by looking at religious belief. The Romans had a policy of incorporating native gods into their own pantheon. For example, the goddess Sulis, who was worshipped at a place called Aquae Sulis, now called Bath, was considered by the Romans to be the equivalent of their goddess Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. It is important to remember that the building of towns and all of the traditionally Roman things in them, such as baths and temples, were almost always paid for by the local elites, not the emperor or the central Roman government.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As far as these settlements go, there were four main types. The first were the colonii, such as Lindum Colonia, modern-day Lincoln, which were the high-status, wealthy centres which were where military veterans and Roman citizens were settled. Another type of Roman settlement were the municipia, the only
as a Spanish speaker, well, I guess English, it makes a lot of, it sounds like coloniae, or however you pronounce that. It means colony, and as a Spanish speaker, it instantly rung a bell.
One in Britain being Verulamium. Most of those that lived in Municipia were not Roman citizens, though. The next were civitates, such as Corinium, now called Cirencester, which were large Romanized settlements of conquered people. Finally were the Vici, which were small settlements that often sprang up around Roman garrisons to benefit from trade with the army. It should be noted that most people living in Roman Britain did not live in urban centres. Between 80 and 90% of people lived in rural areas, with most being peasant farmers. These people did not become Romanised, and life for them changed little except for the fact that they had large urban markets to sell their excess crops to. The amount of effort put into Romanising and urbanising Britain varied greatly over the decades, but one emperor who put a great deal of effort into promoting development was Hadrian, who actually visited Britain in the year 122. Hadrian paid for development in Londinium, and an attempt was made to drain part of the Fens, an area of swampland here, in order to increase arable land. Of course, what Hadrian is most famous for in Roman Britain is Hadrian's Wall, which started construction
Hadrian's
in 122
Wall,
and
right,
was
of
completed
course.
in 128. There are a couple of misconceptions about this wall. One, it does not mark the border between modern-day England and Scotland, and in fact all of it is in England. And two, it was not designed to keep everyone out, but was a series of border checkpoints through which traders could travel, providing they paid a tax. 20 years later, another wall was built to the north of Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall, which was mostly made of earth. Shockingly, the Antonine Wall was built during the reign of Antoninus.
Wow, I really thought that Hadrian's Wall was like the border between England and Scotland.
Pius, Hadrian's successor. The wall was mainly for publicity back in Rome and was abandoned shortly after its construction by Antoninus' successor, Marcus Aurelius. This was probably due to the fact that the land between the Hadrian and Antonine walls was barren and needed expensive development in order to supply the garrison there. Furthermore, there was also a major revolt south of Hadrian's Wall in...
Yeah, that's also correct. The municipia word in Latin sounds a lot like the Spanish word municipio, which translated to English would mean like county, something like that.
158, which had to be suppressed. The fact that throughout the Roman period, Britain was never home to less than 3 legions, roughly 15,000 men and their auxiliaries, is proof that Rome never managed to fully pacify Britain.
Bro, for real, the Roman army
After Marcus
is incredibly impressive.
In 180, rule of the empire was left to his son, Commodus, who was terrible. Not much happened in Britain during his reign, except for a few legionary revolts and the appointment of a man called Pertinax to the governorship of Britain. So, Commodus was assassinated in 192 and was succeeded by Pertinax, who was the first emperor in what is known as the Year of the 5 Emperors, because at this point, why not? The civil wars that took place during this period saw the legions in Britain declare a man called Clodius Albinus emperor, but ultimately he failed. The winner of this conflict was a man called Septimius Severus, who founded the Severan dynasty and is considered by some to be the divide between the early Roman Empire and the late, which we'll get to next week.
I'm sure
we'll do. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some recommended books in the description below. And
oh, there's books. I wonder which... There is no books, dude. Yeah, there's no books. He lied to me. Well, late Roman Britain, okay, we're gonna learn the end of the Roman Empire in the United Kingdom. Well, Britain, you can't call it the UK. It'd be a municipality, yeah. Oh, municipality. Is in the US, is there something as a municipality? I thought like the county subdivision was the smallest.
And Septimius Severus has just defeated his rivals and brought an end to the civil wars which were a part of the Year of the 5 Emperors. He was the first emperor of the Severan dynasty, and this dynasty saw a shift in how powerful the military was. During the Severan dynasty's rule, senators in Rome were sidelined in favour of generals called legati, who were now in charge of running many aspects of the empire. During the turmoil, Britain, or Britannia as it was known then, was subject to raids from north of Hadrian's Wall, so Emperor Severus paid a visit to Britain in 208 in order to conquer Caledonia once and for all. His arrival meant that Londinium and Eboracum underwent major public works so that they could house the emperor and his imperial government. Severus went north, strengthened Hadrian's Wall and went campaigning in Caledonia. Despite heavy losses, Severus was victorious and by 210 he'd expanded Roman control to here. Roughly 5 seconds later, the Caledonians revolted against Roman rule and Severus prepared another campaign, but
starting the tradition of the Caledonians revolting,
fell ill shortly after it began. He returned to Eboracum and died in 211. He was succeeded by his sons Geta and Caracalla, the latter of which continued campaigning in Caledonia but eventually withdrew. Caracalla's campaign would be the last time Rome would advance beyond the Antonine Wall. Geta and Caracalla ruled as joint emperors, but Geta found himself somewhat murdered before the end of their first year and the empire went to Caracalla. Caracalla is most famous for 2 things. First, he was crazy, and second, he granted Roman citizenship to all free males, barring some exceptions, across the empire in 212.
Only males.
This brings an interesting point on how to refer to the people of Britannia during this period. Many historians use the term Romano-British since it recognises them being Roman citizens, but also doesn't diminish the fact that many outside of the towns were not Romanised. After Caracalla, there was a period of stability until 235 when the Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated, which ushered in what is known as the 3rd century crisis. So, the crisis of the 3rd century was a period of about 50 years when generals would one after the other declare themselves or be declared emperor. The legions they commanded would march across the empire to defeat rival claimants. This was massively destabilizing, and many provinces were ransacked by legions and often left defenseless from barbarian incursions. Britannia was slightly different in that...
Now, this period of history is very important because it started the tradition in Europe, and I think we saw this a little bit of one of Crot's videos on Mexico. Europe was a land of, you could kill the king, take his land, and now, boom, you're the king because you killed the king and took his land. You had a bigger army. So this right here is like the start of what would become the continent of Europe. So it's very
There is
important.
little evidence for mass plundering, and archaeological evidence shows that during the last few decades of the 3rd century, many villas were still being built. Ultimately, the crisis is a very complicated period, but needless to say it was extremely damaging, as evidenced by the fact it contained the year of the 6 emperors. During the crisis, Britannia often found itself split from the rest of the empire. Between 260 and 274, Britannia and Gallia were a part of a separate empire called the Gallic Empire, but it was eventually reconquered. A few decades later, a naval commander called Carausius declared himself the ruler of the Britannic Empire, which included roughly these lands. Carausius was assassinated by one of his own men,
Momento.
Alexius, in 293.
I've heard that name a lot. Yeah, I
defeated
guess he's like
3
one of
years
his
later by
patrons.
Caesar Constantius Chlorus, and Britannia was reincorporated into the empire. The crisis of the 3rd century was ended primarily by a man called Diocletian, who created a form of government called the Tetrarchy.
Yeah, you're right
meaning
about the
rule of 4.
municipality thing.
The empire was thus ruled by
At least
4
in
emperors,
Mexico.
2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, whom the empire was split between. Unlike the early empire, whereby there was some social mobility, such as rural farmers and artisans being able to move to urban centres, Diocletian made efforts to control the movement of people and skills. He did this by making ties to land and some jobs, such as being a soldier, hereditary. He also attempted to regulate prices on certain goods across the empire. In Britannia, the prices of beer and rugs were controlled in order to stabilise the economy, but this failed miserably since people just traded for these goods instead of using money. Though, to be fair to Diocletian, nobody understood economic concepts such as inflation back then. Another one of Diocletian's reforms in Britannia was to divide it into 4 provinces from its previous 2. These provinces were grouped into larger administrative units called dioceses, and it was run by previous 2.
Interesting.
These provinces...
I don't know what the modern border of Wales looks like, but I'm pretty sure this was the predecessor for that.
Were grouped into larger administrative units called dioceses, and it was run by a vicarius, which is the root of the word vicar. The reason for the splitting of the provinces was to make sure that it would be more difficult for the governors of these provinces to usurp the throne. So Constantius, having previously defeated Alexius, returned to his duties as Caesar before his elevation to Augusti in 306. Constantius, like most emperors, wanted glory, and so looked to a potential conquest of Caledonia to provide it, because all of the previous attempts had gone so swimmingly. Constantius went north of Hadrian's Wall and defeated the people who lived there, called the Picts, in battle. Unfortunately for him, he could not finish this conquest since he fell ill and had to return to York. Before he died, he recommended that his son, Constantine, be declared Augustus by the army after his death. It was easy for Constantine to be accepted as emperor because, much like during the reign of Septimius Severus, the Roman government had travelled to Britannia with Constantius. There was one problem with this, though. There was already an agreed successor to Constantius, Flavius Severus, who was murdered in 307. So shockingly, once again, the Roman Empire was now in crisis. Constantine, through political manoeuvring and a fortunate victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, secured his position, but not before his famous conversion to Christianity. Constantine managed to oust the other emperors, and by 324 he was the sole ruler of the empire.
But didn't he move
Just
the capital to Constantinople?
Christian did not mean that the empire's provinces
Is this
automatically
that Constantine?
became majority Christian. The process of Christianization in Britain was a slow one, but goes back much further than Constantine. There is little evidence for widespread Christianity before the 3rd
Europe's
century.
always at war.
One of the most famous Christian stories from Roman Britain is
true.
that of St. Alban, the first British Christian martyr. Long story short, Alban, or Albanus, sheltered a priest fleeing persecution and converted to Christianity. He was arrested and refused to abandon his new faith, and thus was beheaded at Verulamium, which bears the name St. Alban's. Certainly, though, by the mid-4th century there was a sizable Christian population in Britain. So Constantine died in 337, and the empire was split between his sons. Britannia went to Constantine II, who managed to swiftly get himself killed by his brother Constans, who then took over the western half of the empire. In 350, Constans took the time to be murdered after one of his generals, Magnentius, declared himself emperor and seized Constans' share. Magnentius would only reign for 3 years before being defeated by Constantine's last living son, Constantius. Because Magnentius had the support of Britain, and Constantius believed many of his supporters fled there, he ordered that they be hunted down. The man ordered to do this was a civil servant named Paulus. Paulus earned the nickname catena, which is Latin for chain. This was due to Paulus's penchant for chaining
Cadena,
suspects
yeah.
and dragging
In
them
Spanish,
through the streets.
chain is
Paulus
cadena.
was only tasked with hunting the supporters of Magnentius, but quickly began to prosecute notable families on trumped-up charges. Those found guilty were imprisoned, exiled, tortured, and notably had their property taken from them. An important side effect of the destruction of many wealthy families meant that public works such as city walls, roads, and temples were much less likely to be undertaken. Another major destructive event for Britain occurred in 367 in what is known as the Barbarian Conspiracy. This was a well-planned series of simultaneous attacks by different groups of people. Britannia was attacked by the Picts, the Atticotti, no one knows where they came from, and the Scots, who were from Ireland or Hibernia as the Romans referred to it then. Gaul was also attacked by the Franks and another group of people called the Saxons, who will become important shortly. These attacks, despite their ferocity, were thwarted by the general Theodosius, who subsequently oversaw the rebuilding of Britain.
Did he said Scots? I mean, he means another tribe, but that's an interesting name.
Britain's defences. Over the closing decades of the 4th century, Britain was involved
Scots
in
in
another imperial
Ireland.
crisis. Shocking, I know. This was when a Roman general called Magnus Maximus defeated the Picts and declared himself
Magnus
emperor in
Maximus.
382 because everyone else
great
did
name.
it, so, why not? He was defeated by the Emperor Theodosius the Great in 394, who himself died the next year, which marks the permanent split between the east and western halves of the empire. Over the next half a century, the Western Roman Empire, now under the rule of Emperor Honorius, was divided and strained by near-continuous civil strife and foreign invasions. In Britannia, this came in the form of the Picts and the Scots raiding down the coastlines. Much of what happened during the early 5th century is hard to determine, but it is certain that Rome, more accurately Ravenna, which was now the capital, began to lose its grip on the provinces, including Britannia. After 402, there is evidence for a massive slowdown in the imports of coinage from the rest of the empire into Britannia, which means that the soldiers and civil servants who worked there were being paid from local sources and not
they
the
were
central
starting
government.
to lose
It should
control.
be remembered that it was not just the legions which relied on payments of coinage from the government, but also those who sold goods to the legions too. It goes without saying that any downturn in payments for the legions would result in an economic hit to the entirety of Britannia. In 406, Britannia saw a quick succession of 3 usurpers to the imperial throne, because why only have economic collapse when you can have revolt too? At this point, the central Roman government couldn't respond very well since they were busy being overrun by barbarians. The final usurper, called Constantine III, declared himself emperor in 407 and was quite successful. He conquered Gaul and Hispania from Honorius and pushed back the Germanic invaders. In order to do this, he withdrew most of the military from Britannia, leaving it pretty much defenceless. The Picts, the Scots, and the Saxons leapt on this weakness by launching devastating raids. The civil administration of Britannia wrote to Emperor Honorius asking to be allowed to arm themselves to fight off the invaders, which he granted in what is known as the 410 Rescript of Honorius. Some consider this rescript as the Romans abandoning Britannia to its own fate. It should be remembered that the people of Britannia were still Roman citizens, and many of those who lived in the cities would have identified as such. It is likely that to Honorius, him granting permission for citizens to arm themselves was a temporary measure and not the abandonment of a province which had been part of the empire for nearly 400 years.
Yeah, dude.
So this rearmament worked at first, and the Romano-British were able to win some victories. However, after
Think about
continued
Britain
raiding,
400
economic
years
downturn,
ago.
and the collapse of the civil administration, Britannia fell into chaos. This economic downturn
That's a
can
long
be seen
time.
in many ways. Pottery production came to a crashing halt, coinage and a money-based economy continued to decline, urban centres were depopulated, and countryside villas were no longer being built. Without a functioning economy, there was no way to pay the administration or the army, and without anything to hold the provinces together, Britannia fractured and would never again be under Roman jurisdiction. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching. There are some
Whoa,
recommended
and
books
that was the end of Roman Britannia, man. Fun fact, my son Sug is Old English Anglo-Saxon word meaning small bird. That's interesting. You know, old... It really fascinates me, Old English history and Old English in general as a language. It's pretty interesting to learn. I think there are clips of people like speaking Old English. Of course, not like the OG speakers, but I don't know. That I find it very fascinating. The early Anglo-Saxons and the Mercian supremacy
have left Britannia, sort of. They probably intended to come back, but they were too busy being conquered by Germanic barbarians.
Yeah.
It should be noted straight out of the
At
gate
this time,
that
the
early 5th century
Germanic
Britain was very
barbarians,
difficult to
I guess the
understand since
the
nobody
Huns
wrote
came a
about it.
little earlier.
What is known comes from 3 major sources. The first was written by a 6th century monk called Gildas, the second by an 8th century Northumbrian monk called Bede, and the last is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. More on that in a bit. So neither the exact details of events nor their dates are known, but Britain was subject to waves of invasion and settlement by several groups of Germanic peoples in the early 5th century. These were the Angles, who were from here, the Jutes, who were from here, and the Saxons, from here.
I mean, that's
Collectively,
called
these people are
Jutland,
referred
right?
to as the Anglo-Saxons. There are many myths and legends surrounding their arrival, but
And
the
that's
most
called
famous is that of
Saxony,
Hengist
so-
and Horsa, who landed here in Kent sometime around the year 450. For the sake of simplicity, those who were living in Britain before the Anglo-Saxon arrival are referred to as Britons, but be aware that many did not see themselves as part of some great collective. The same can be said of those from the continent, who are often described with the umbrella term Germanic. According to Gildas's
but there was no
interpretation
Germany,
of
of
events,
course.
a tyrant king of the Britons, sometimes called Vortigern, was having problems with raids from the Picts and the Scots. He called for help from the Saxon mercenaries who were led by Hengist and
Dude,
Horsa.
it's getting good.
The Saxons defeated the Picts and asked for greater payments. When the Britons could not provide it, they revolted and began to conquer the island.
Yeah, conquer more land.
The story continues that early on the Britons were consistently beaten back until the emergence of a leader called Ambrosius Aurelianus, who, around the year 500,
Still
defeated
Roman
the
names?
Saxons at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, which established a period of peace until Gildas's lifetime. So, side note, Ambrosius Aurelianus forms the basis of one of England's most famous legends, that of King Arthur. To disappoint literally everyone, there is no compelling evidence of Arthur's existence, and what weak evidence there is was written 500 years later. Naturally, historians only have Gildas's word on this, and it should be noted he wasn't writing history, but a series of polemics which blames the state of Britain in his lifetime on the secular and religious leaders of the age. What can be said to have definitely happened was that starting from the second quarter of the 5th century, there was a settlement of peoples along the southern and eastern coast of what is now England, and by the end of the 6th century had created a series of small kingdoms. The Jutes settled Kent and the Isle of Wight, creating the kingdoms of Kent and Witwara. The Angles settled the eastern coast and the Midlands. In the north, these settlements became the kingdom of Bernicia and Deira, whilst in the south, the kingdom of East Anglia, literally meaning East Angleland, was founded. Of the middle settlements, by far the most important was the kingdom of Mercia, but there are others, such as the kingdom of Lindsey. The Saxons settled the southern coast around the Jutes, founding the kingdoms of Essex, Sussex, and Wessex, meaning East Saxons, South Saxons, and West Saxons, respectively. Thus, Britain was divided.
Are there parts of England that are still called like Wessex? I mean, they are, right? I've heard that name a lot.
Kingdoms, and some Britons.
I guess if you could do like DNA testing on the people who live on those regions, you could probably get, people in southern England have more of a Saxon heritage, but people living on the coast have more of a Danish, what we know today as Danish, right?
Fled, settling what is now called Brittany.
Brittany,
the exact dates and natures of these foundings are essentially lost to time, but these kingdoms were firmly established by the year 600.
Same thing with the people
of
Brittany.
This period is known as the heptarchy, meaning the rule of 7, due to there being 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but it should be remembered that there were many more. There were also Brittonic kingdoms such as Strathclyde and Dumnonia, alongside the Welsh kingdoms of Powys and Dyfed. The cultural dividing lines between these kingdoms is hard to define, and it is difficult to know whether the Angles would have seen themselves
It does, it really does. This time in English history feels very
saw themselves
mythical,
as different
you know?
from the Germanic newcomers, however. One crucial difference between these two groups was religion. It is unknown how prevalent Christianity was at this time amongst the Britons, but Gildas and the Brittonic settlement at St. Alban show that Christianity was certainly alive on the island. The Germanic settlers / invaders, whatever you want to call them, were not Christians, however, they were pagans. This wasn't paganism in the Roman sense, with formal rituals and well-documented festivals, but one which varied wildly depending on who was practicing it. Germanic paganism had many gods, such as Tyr, Woden, and Thunor, who gave their names to some of the days of the week. So, in 595, Pope Gregory I sent a monk called Augustine to Britain with the intent of converting the peoples that lived there. Augustine arrived in 597, landed here at the Isle of Thanet in the Kingdom of Kent, whose capital was Canterbury. Kent at this time was ruled by King Ethelbert, and he was at first suspicious of the missionaries, thinking they were going to put a spell on him, but eventually he gave them permission to preach, and at some point, nobody knows exactly when, Ethelbert himself converted. This was not Ethelbert's first run-in with Christianity, since his wife Bertha was a Frankish princess and also a Christian. By 601, many in Kent had been converted, and Augustine was appointed as the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Ethelbert's conversion to Christianity did not just have social and religious impacts, but political ones too. The reason for this was that Ethelbert was not just the King of Kent, but also the Overlord of Britain, meaning the other kings answer to him. The position of Overlord is sometimes referred to as Bretwalders, but actually this title was not in use until several centuries later. Ethelbert used his position of power to influence other kings to convert as well. After Ethelbert's death, the position of Overlord went to King Raedwald of East Anglia. Raedwald had previously been converted under pressure from Ethelbert, but he was not a particularly good convert since he kept both Christian and pagan shrines.
Pretty nice.
Raedwald was also likely to be the man who was buried at Sutton Hoo, famous for housing this helmet. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not only a product of Rome, but also of the surrounding peoples. For example, the kingdom of Dalriata was home to a major monastery, Iona, founded by the Irish abbot Columba. From this monastery came Aidan, a monk who travelled to Northumbria, which is called so because it is the land north of the river Humber, which is here. He did this under the invitation of King Oswald, who had united the two kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira after a long period of assassination and warfare which had gripped the two kingdoms. Oswald, who was born a pagan, grew up as an exile in Dalriata due to the aforementioned turbulence.
There's a lot to take in, dude. Calm down.
The Brittonic and Roman churches had their slight variations, but the biggest differences between them was the dating of Easter, which Bede took very seriously. Side note, the name Easter actually comes from the pagan goddess Estra, whose feast was probably held around the same time as the Christian celebration. The issues surrounding Easter were settled in Northumbria during the
It comes from a pagan god. Think about that.
664 Synod of Whitby, which was called by King Oswiu. Oswiu sided with the Roman Church's position, thus bringing Northumbria into the world of the Catholic Church. This connection to the Roman world helped open up many Northumbrian monasteries to Roman books and learning. The most notable of these monasteries was the monk Wearmouth Jarrow Abbey, which was notable because that was where Bede was educated and worked from. The century between 650 and 750 is sometimes known as the Northumbrian Renaissance or the Golden Age of Northumbria due to the increased output of literary and artistic works by its monasteries. Bede's ecclesiastical history is the best known work from monk Wearmouth Jarrow and is one of the major sources for early.
So I guess that's why, for example, when they tell the story, and I guess we're going to learn about the Vikings later, they say it's said that they raided and burned a lot of monasteries around the coast. So I guess this is where they come from, this like golden era of, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pronounce the name, but
Saxon history. Another major monastery was Lindisfarne, which produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, but may have also produced the Book of Durrow, but nobody knows for sure. These monasteries were extremely wealthy and often sat in isolated areas along the coast to promote a holy life away from the rest of civilization. Of course, loading up these coastal monasteries with immense treasures with only monks to defend them would eventually cause problems, such as in 793 when a group of Vikings raided and looted Lindisfarne.
Oh, okay, that's it.
Okay. It was not just a period of artistic growth, but also one of political supremacy. The Northumbrian kings Edwin, Oswald and Oswiu were all overlords of Britain and held considerable power over the southern kingdoms. One demonstration of Northumbrian power was that York was chosen as the seat of Britain's second archbishop. This period was not one of constant Northumbrian hegemony, however, since both Edwin and Oswald met their ends at the hand of Penda, the king of Mercia, who was also a pagan. Mercia had been a rising power for many decades at this point, since unlike most of the southern kingdoms, it had room to expand and neighbours to loot. Penda was killed by Oswiu, who ruled over Mercia for 3 years between 655 and 658, but Mercia, under their new king, Wulfhere, revolted against him. Over the next half a century, Mercia and Northumbria would vie for dominance, with no major victor emerging. In fact, after Oswiu's short reign in Mercia, neither would ever manage to dominate the other again. So, in 716, a man called Ethelred became the king of Mercia and managed to entrench what is called the Mercian supremacy. The exact dates for the start of the supremacy vary, but during his reign, Ethelred was able to firmly assert control over all of the southern kingdoms. This was not a simple task, since early on in his reign he was challenged by Witred of Kent and Ine of Wessex. Fortunately for Ethelred, Witred died in 725, and his kingdom was divided between his sons, and the next year Ine abdicated to become a monk. The exact extent of Ethelred's control over kingdoms like Kent and Wessex is debated, but throughout his life he most certainly was the most powerful king south of the Humber. Mercia did not annex the kingdoms it held hegemony over, and many operated with some independence. Ethelred died in 757 and was succeeded by Bjornred, who was quickly chased off by Offa, the most famous king of Mercia. The hegemony established by Ethelred had collapsed, and Offa had to reassert Mercian dominance, which he managed to do, despite some hiccups. Under Offa, the Mercian supremacy reached its height, and he brought in a series of reforms, the most notable of which was the introduction of the penny. Offa, like those before him, never managed to assert authority over the Welsh kingdoms to the west and was consistently plagued by raiding. In response, a great dyke, shockingly referred to as Offa's dyke, was constructed running along most of the Mercian Welsh border. It was essentially a large ditch with a mound of earth on the other side. It was no Hadrian's Wall, but it certainly would have required a lot of manpower to make. Offa's authority over Britain was recognised overseas as well, and this is demonstrated in two ways. The first is by the fact that he managed to negotiate the appointment of a third archbishop.
He tried to emulate the Franks, particularly Charlemagne.
The Archbishop of Lichfield, which is here, although please be aware it didn't.
That's interesting. It's so cool because now we are starting to see France and England take place. You know, it's the baby versions of them.
Last very long. Another is the letter he received from the Frankish king Charlemagne, which begins, Charles, by the grace of God, king of the Franks and Lombards, patrician of the Romans, to his esteemed and dearest brother Offa, king of the Mercians. This shows that Offa was certainly authoritative enough to garner Charlemagne's attention, but make no mistake, Charlemagne would not have seen Offa as an equal. Just look at their kingdoms. Offa's domination of the southern kingdoms would continue until his death in 796, except for a small blip in East Anglia, which ended in Offa having the East Anglian king beheaded. After this, Mercia was ruled by a bunch of weak kings, and it never managed to really recover the same levels of authority and was consistently challenged by the other southern kingdoms. The Mercian supremacy came to a swift end in 825 at the Battle of Ellendun, in which the king of Wessex, Egbert, defeated the Mercian king Beornwulf, which ushered in the rise of Wessex. Ultimately, Mercia's primary issue was the succession, since whenever a king died, the supremacy collapsed and had to be built up again by whomever won the inevitable civil war. Offa had tried to fix this previously, but all this did was get his son killed after he died. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some recommended books in the description below and feel free.
There is no books, man. Why do you lie? Oh, no, yeah, there's actually books on this one. Oh, I'm sorry, that's my mistake. Okay, so let me just drink a little bit of water. This is a lot of information to take in. I'm gonna probably watch them again. But guys, for you watching on the stream or the people who are gonna watch on YouTube, of course, you can like the video and subscribe, and especially help me out checking my links on the description. That's always very nice. Especially because like one of my courses on Skillshare got shut down. And that's bad. You know, it gave me like, that course alone was giving me like $400 a month. And now I don't have that. So any support would be appreciated. Anyways, Alfred the Great and the Rise of Skywalker. No, okay.
825, Wessex is victorious.
Wessex. Okay, perfect.
At the Battle of Ellendon, ending the Mercian supremacy. This victory was quickly followed by Wessex annexing all of these southern kingdoms. All of this occurred under the rule of King Egbert, who had previously been exiled to Francia by the Mercian king Offa.
Okay, so we
After
stopped
Offa's death,
with the
Egbert returned
Latin
to Wessex,
names.
probably with the help of Charlemagne, and was crowned king in 802.
Yeah.
His reign was one of Wessex's most successful. 4 years after his victory, Egbert invaded Mercia and managed to force the Mercian king Wiglaf into exile. Soon afterwards, he invaded Northumbria and received the submission of its king. Egbert is thus considered to be an overlord of Britain at this point, but like most things, it didn't last, because by 830, Mercia had revolted against him. Mercia couldn't pry the southern kingdoms from Wessex, and East Anglia became an independent kingdom again. Egbert's later rule did contain further setbacks, though. For example, in 835, Kent was heavily plundered by Vikings, and the next year he was defeated by the Danes here. However, in 838, he did win a victory over them and their Dumnonian allies. Attacks by Vikings, who are commonly referred to in sources as Danes, increased dramatically over the following decades. The majority of the Vikings who attacked the Anglo-Saxons during this period were from Denmark, hence Danes. Some were from modern-day Norway though, and those Vikings were referred to as Norse. Quick fact, the term Viking actually comes from the Old English term vikinger, which means pirate. So the increase in activity culminated in the 865 Great Heathen Army, which landed here in East Anglia. The difference with the Great Heathen Army, called so because the Vikings were pagans, and the previous raiding parties was that now the Vikings were in Britain for conquest. Within 4 years of their landing, East Anglia and Northumbria had been defeated. East Anglia was hence ruled by Danes, and Northumbria was split in half, the northern half remaining under the rule of the Angles. Wessex at this point was ruled by King Ethelred, the fourth eldest son of Ethelwulf, Egbert's successor. In 870, the Great Heathen Army camped at Reading, here, before invading Wessex. Ethelred was victorious against the Danes, inflicting upon them their first defeat. The Danes bounced back and in 871 defeated the West Saxon forces at the Battle of Basing, roughly here. To make things worse, King Ethelred died and was succeeded by his brother, Alfred, better known nowadays as Alfred the Great. Ethelred actually had a son called Ethelwald, but Alfred was chosen to be king instead. This is because the crown did not necessarily
someone is a good leader when they call them
the Witan, the King's advisory council, made up of high-ranking nobles, was involved in the succession. Most of the time, they simply rubber-stamped the king's appointed heir, who was often the eldest son. Alfred was chosen over Ethelwald because Ethelwald was still a child at this point, and the situation with the Vikings required stability. The fact that Wessex could appoint kings without having to suffer a civil war each time was one of the reasons it stood as firmly as it did. One thing that ought to be remembered is that the Anglo-Saxons were not
what's the
mortal
Prussian
enemies
guy,
that could
dude?
never coexist, and rival claimants to a throne could and did enlist Vikings for support. Alfred began his reign by bravely paying the Vikings to leave. Thus, the Great Heathen Army went north to pillage Mercia before splitting in half. One half went north to settle Northumbria, and the other, led by a man called Guthrum, went south back to Wessex in 876. The Vikings didn't really do much.
I love the character designs
they split
on
up
these.
again to divide Mercia, leaving an even smaller force under Guthrum, which launched a surprise
They're
attack
very
to
unique.
Wessex the next year. Alfred was
like
forced to flee to
oversimplifying.
Athelney in the marshes of Somerset, which is here. He waited there as his forces were mustered across Wessex, and after assembling, they fought the Danes at the Battle of Edington. This was a decisive victory for Alfred. The subsequent peace treaty between Alfred and Guthrum did several important things. First, Guthrum was baptized, taking the name Ethelstan with Alfred as his adopted father. Secondly, Alfred accepted Danish occupation of these lands, whilst in return these lands were considered Alfred's, with Alfred notably gaining western Mercia. Incidentally, the dividing line between the Danish and Saxon
Mercia got splitted between the Danes and Wessex.
Parts of modern-day England roughly follow an old Roman road called Watling Street. Having won a major victory and secured a peace, Alfred began the task of securing his kingdom from further Viking raids. There were three major ways he did this. The first was to reform the army.
Gonna be a little
Alfred
bit
changed
hard.
the way that troops were raised so that only half of the levy troops were active at any time. This is important because most soldiers were taken from farms to fight, meaning that there were less people to grow and harvest crops. Thus, the army was smaller
Frederick
but
the
more
Great.
efficient, and
Yeah, you're
importantly,
right.
Wessex
That's
had a
the
standing army
name.
at all
Shit, how
times,
could I
meaning it
forget?
could respond
Like all the Prussian kings were called Frederick, so
to raids immediately.
so dumb.
The next
dude.
change was a naval build-up, which made it harder for the seaborne Vikings to land on Wessex's long coastline. The final and arguably the most important change that Alfred made was the creation of a system of burhs, which were fortified towns. There were roughly 30 of these, and they were manned by the newly reformed army. These burhs acted as garrisons and sanctuary in case of Viking attack, but they also grew as important economic centres. Some burhs, such as Winchester, were already protected by Roman walls and only required manning and repair. Others, such as Wallingford, were built from scratch. Each burh was assigned a number of hides, which were measurements used to denote the value of land. It's a very complex system, and a hide does not represent a certain amount of land, but its value. Land used for cattle would be worth more hides than that used for growing wheat. For the defence of burhs, one man was required from each hide. Also, burhs did not have a standard size. For example, the burh at Winchester required 2,400 men for its defence, whereas the one at Southampton only required 150. The details of the system come from a document called the Burg or Hidage, which indicates that in order to man all of the burhs across Wessex, 27,000 men were required, which is an impressive amount. Alfred did not just oversee the innovations in the army, he was also responsible for great changes in the nature and appearance of kingship. For example, Alfred began to brand himself as not simply the king of Wessex, but as the king of the Saxons, thus making him king to even those who lived under the Vikings. To secure Mercian compliance, Alfred married his daughter Ethelred to the Lord of Mercia, Ethelred.
Yeah, that's what a lot of leaders do. Like when Russia or France would call themselves the protectors of Christians within the Ottoman Empire. You know, that's a dangerous
Mercia
move.
did still have some autonomy. Alfred did show
The
good
king
faith
of
to
the
Mercians
Wessex.
when he captured London
Sorry,
in
the Saxons.
886, and instead of incorporating it into Wessex, he handed it over to Mercia. Mercians had little reason to rebel against Alfred for two reasons. The first was that Alfred was known for being a just king, and the second was that by allying themselves with Wessex, they had better protection from Viking incursions.
Yeah, he was not a
One consequence
Viking.
of Viking raiding and invasion was the destruction of monasteries, which in turn had a major effect on learning and education. Major monasteries such as Monkwearmouth, Jarrow, Lindisfarne and Iona had all been sacked by Vikings. Many learned men were killed, their libraries burned, and their wealth transported back to Scandinavia. This led to what Alfred described as a sharp downturn in learning, which he sought to correct.
Smart people.
To do this, he began inviting some of the most learned men across the kingdom to his court to help. It is likely that Alfred was exaggerating just how bad learning had become, since many of his new advisors were from Mercia. For example, Plegmund, who would later become the Archbishop of Canterbury, and at least 3 others were Mercians. Some were from foreign kingdoms too, such as Grimbald, a Frankish monk, and Asser, a Welsh monk, and the most famous of Alfred's court intellectuals. This revival of learning is often called the Alfredian Renaissance, and unlike the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, Alfred was personally involved in the production of some of its literature. Much of this Renaissance was centered around language, specifically when a person should use Latin or use English. It was decided that most people should learn to read and write in English, with only the clergy needing to study Latin. Alfred was himself learning Latin during the period of peace with the Vikings, and he used his newfound knowledge to translate some works into English. Alfred sums up his reasoning for translating documents into English as such. It seems better to me that we should turn into language that we can all understand some books which may be most necessary for all men to know. He was referencing religious works which would teach good morals to his subjects. It's important to remember that many saw the Viking invasions as a punishment by God for bad behaviour, and to Alfred, reinvigorating learning was one way to counter this. A quick side note on language. One aspect of Anglo-Saxon culture which differentiates it from its continental European contemporaries is the prevalence of the vernacular language, that is, Old English, and its use instead of Latin. Other kingdoms, such as Francia, had their own vernacular languages, but things like law codes and treaties were always written in Latin, whereas in Anglo-Saxon England a significant number were written in Old English. One such document was Alfred's Law Code, produced sometime in the latter half of his reign. Alfred interestingly begins his law code demanding that all men keep the oaths they've made, which may imply that this has been an issue. The Alfredian Renaissance did not just copy old works, but also sought the creation of new ones. The first was Asser's Life of Alfred, which, whilst probably a propaganda piece designed for distribution to the Welsh, is vitally important for understanding Alfred as a person. Another document that was most likely created around this time was the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is essentially an annual list of major events. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was kept and updated for many years, and the version of the Chronicle found at Medeshamsted, modern-day Peterborough, was updated well into the 12th century. The Chronicle, alongside Bede's Ecclesiastical History, are by far the two most important sources for Anglo-Saxon England, and without them very little would be known about the years between the Roman withdrawal and the Norman Conquest. Wessex wouldn't be at peace forever, and sure enough, it wasn't. In 892, another great army landed in Wessex. Thanks to the new system of burhs, the Vikings were not able to get anywhere near as far inland as they had in the 870s. Unfortunately for Mercia, they had few burhs, and so the Vikings marched through their territory and eventually into Wales, which at this point was still divided into smaller kingdoms, most or all of whom had pledged their allegiance to Alfred. This was the last major Danish incursion into the territory of Wessex before Alfred's death in 899. Alfred had thus managed to turn Wessex from a kingdom struggling to resist the Vikings to the sole Anglo-Saxon power. It was on top of the foundations built by Alfred that the royal house of Wessex would go on to be the first royal house of England. Alfred saw himself as the architect of an England, but be aware that this was never realised in his lifetime. The northern half of Northumbria still remained a nominally independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and the continued obedience of Mercia was no sure thing. Nowadays, Alfred occupies a place in the English national psyche as the founder of the nation. Of course, most of the information which survives from his reign was written in his court by his
Alfred the Great, yeah, of course, it made sense.
Should be taken with a grain of salt. Irrespective of all of this,
I mean, if he's going to be called Alfred the Great,
in the direction that made sure that this land would ultimately be English and not Scandinavian. We're often told to avoid great man history where possible, but in the case of Alfred, it's difficult to strip him of this title, and it's worth remembering that of all the kings of this land, he is the only one to have ever been the Great.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, if you are called the Great by your people, I guess, it's probably because you are a really big deal. So next history, and we have more Vikings, the Vikings and the Danelaw. I don't know what that means, but we're gonna find out. We're close to the year 1000.
The Vikings are trading peacefully. Whilst trading in Britain, they would have been made aware of these wonderful places called monasteries, which were filled with treasure, had no defences barring a few monks, and often sat
Come at me, bro.
Shockingly, dumping unbelievable wealth in easy-to-reach places attracted the attention of people who wanted such wealth, and in 793, a monastery called Lindisfarne in Northumbria was ransacked by seaborne raiders. Over the next decade, more of these raids occurred, with the monasteries of Monkwearmouth Jarrow and Iona facing the same fate alongside many coastal settlements.
So okay, you know what, guys? We only have 2 viewers, so you know what, couple of guys, give me a second. I'm gonna go to the bathroom. I'm so sorry, but I'll see you soon. Okay, don't go. I'll be back soon. No. No, pues no, bro. ¿Qué pasó, amigo? Ya sé, no quiero. All right. We are back. Oh shit, that's a big ass zoom, huh? I'm sorry. I just wanted a glass Because shit, I'm gonna drink, dude. Why not? Yeah, it's just a cheap ass red label. You know the drill. And my fridge doesn't work and I'm out of ice. So, you know, it's gonna be raw. Oh shit. It's literally gonna be like just plain whiskey, nothing else. And this is Scotch, so it's kind of appropriate. Anyway, let's go.
The term Viking comes from the Old English word vikinger, which means pirate. Not all Vikings were raiders, however. Some were soldiers and nobles who simply served their lords much in the same way the Anglo-Saxons would have. For the sake of simplicity, the term Viking will be used to mean all Scandinavian soldiers and settlers who operated in Britain during this period. The Vikings consisted of two major groups. The first were the Danes from Denmark, who operated mostly in
and the Norse from Norway.
The second group were the Norse from Norway, who focused on the northern coast of Britain as well as Ireland and Wales.
Holy shit.
Raiding continued in the decades following Lindisfarne, culminating
Chile's dream of an
Heathen
empire.
Army landing in East Anglia in 865. The size of this army is debated, but it was the largest army the Vikings had ever assembled and was extremely potent. It was led by two men, Halfdan Ragnarsson, alongside his brother Ivar the Boneless. So the East Anglians paid the Vikings off and agreed to let them winter there, providing they didn't kill everyone. In 866, the Great Heathen Army headed into Northumbria and quickly seized Eorfavik, or York as it's now known. Incidentally, the reason that it was so easy for the Vikings to get to York was because they sailed there. Viking longships were considerably faster than walking or riding, and this was made even easier by the fact that the English coastline did not look like this, as it does today, but in fact it looked like this. The Vikings had arrived at an opportune moment because Northumbria was in the midst of a civil war which saw two kings, Ella and Osbert, try to outmurder each other for the throne. Upon realising the Vikings were in Northumbria, they both united their forces and marched on York, where they and their armies were swiftly butchered. After this, the Vikings placed a puppet king called Edgebert on the throne, and many of the nobles of Northumbria fled north, which split the kingdom into two. The northern half had its capital at Bebbanburg, modern-day Bamburgh, whereas the southern kingdom was centred at York. Over the next couple of years, the Vikings marched through Mercia and they seized the important city of Snottingham, or Nottingham as it's now called. A combined force from Mercia and Wessex attempted to retake the city, but they failed. In 869, the Great Heathen Army went south into East Anglia again, but this time its king, Edmund, refused to pay them off and so met them in battle. Edmund was subsequently captured and executed, thus earning him the moniker Edmund the Martyr. In 871, some reinforcements arrived from Scandinavia and the Vikings turned their attention to Wessex. This invasion didn't come to much when the King of Wessex, Ethelred, defeated the Great Heathen Army before dying and being succeeded by his brother, Alfred, who then paid the Vikings off. The Great Heathen Army continued moving up and down the country over the next few years, and Mercia was eventually toppled in 874. The Viking army then split up, with Guthrum heading south into Wessex and Halfdan taking his band north to fight the Picts and the Britons. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that after defeating the Picts, Halfdan shared out the lands of the Northumbrians and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. So it can be said from this passage in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that the Vikings in Halfdan's portion of the army had permanently settled the land in Northumbria, and for many this is considered the beginning of what is called the Danelaw. So the Danelaw, as the name suggests, was the part of Britain which found itself subject to the Danes and their laws. Of course, some parts of Britain would come under the control of the Norse, but no distinction is made here. The Danelaw was by no means some great unified territory that sat in opposition to the Anglo-Saxons living next door. It was politically divided and there was a lot of cultural blending that went on. In the few years after Halfdan's settlement, by which it is meant that he became king and then took everyone else's land and gave it to his men, the eastern portion of Mercia was divided into what is known as the 5 boroughs. Each of these boroughs was ruled by a noble called a Jarl. The 5 boroughs were centred on 5 towns. I want to know what happened to Londinium, dude. Leicester and Derby. All of these towns would go on to be extremely important regional centres later on, which is why all of them, barring Stamford, have their own counties named after them. As for East Anglia, Guthrum, who had just been baptised as Ethelstan after being defeated by King Alfred of Wessex, became its king. The creation of the Danelaw saw many social, demographic, cultural, religious and economic changes to the areas settled by the Danes. For starters, Danish law stated that the life of an Anglo-Saxon was worth less than that of a Dane. Alfred's treaty with Guthrum stated that in their respective kingdoms, Danes and Anglo-Saxons were to be viewed as equal.
That's what always happened.
This equality did not apply to Britons, though, who were still seen as inferior. One aspect of Danish rule was its pronounced effect on urbanisation.
You know it's bad when the Anglo-Saxons get discriminated, all right? You know it's really bad.
The settlement of York by the Danes, it saw a steady period of
By the
population
widest
growth, and
of
importantly,
wide...
the city's commercial centre
the-
expanded, due in part to
I don't
York's
even know what
useful
I was gonna
location
say.
along the route between Scandinavia and Ireland, and partly due to the fact it was under Scandinavian control. York's importance in international trade grew swiftly. Workshops sprang up and housing shortages led to the building of two-storey buildings, which shows just how developed Viking urban planning could be. This expansion went hand in hand with the economic prosperity that was seen under Danish rule. A part of this prosperity came from the fact that the Danish had settled and thus were no longer pillaging and stealing everything. The uptick in trade meant that some in the Danelaw began to mint their own coins, which gave the kings of the Danelaw greater legitimacy overseas. So the Danelaw did not just attempt to keep up with its neighbouring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but formed its own Anglo-Scandinavian culture. Fortunately for the Vikings, their language, Old Norse, was somewhat mutually intelligible with Old English, which meant that there weren't major barriers between them and the native Anglo-Saxons.
I guess that's why they say that for an English speaker, it's easy to learn like Norwegian or Swedish.
This does not mean that
I
there
don't know
weren't
if
major cultural
Danish
differences
or
between the two
Dane.
ethnic groups, the largest of which was religion. When they arrived, the Vikings were pagans, worshipping numerous gods such as Odin, Freya or Thor, which was problematic for the Christian Anglo-Saxons and Celts already living in Britain. When they first arrived, the Vikings had no qualms with raiding and destroying church property in Britain. Churches were the main centres of learning at this point, which meant that many cultural works and laws did not survive the Viking raiding, which is why so much more is known about places such as Wessex than East Anglia or Northumbria. Evidence of major disruption to the church in pagan lands is seen by looking at many bishoprics. For example, the bishopric in East Anglia didn't reappear for nearly 100 years after Viking appearances, and the bishopric of Lindsey never returned. Pagans and Christians living side by side did create a multi-religious society. Many Vikings took Christian Anglo-Saxon wives, which meant that since women were in charge of raising children, many would have had at least a semi-Christian upbringing. This, coupled with the power and wealth of the church, meant that generally pagan beliefs were replaced by Christian ones within a couple of generations.
Yeah,
one of the reasons
pretty
this
much.
is believed is that Viking-style burials are few and far between in the areas of the Danelaw, but this problem is compounded by the fact that no one knows just how many Vikings actually settled Britain. It could have been that the Vikings simply displaced the ruling Anglo-Saxon class, or that after settlement they brought their families over with them. One way of potentially telling how many Vikings settled is by looking at place names. As a very general rule, the names of Viking-founded towns tend to end in either B or Thorpe, such as Derby or Scunthorpe, whereas Anglo-Saxon towns tend to end in Tun, Ham or Bury, such as Luton, Buckingham or Shaftesbury. There are many exceptions to this rule, however, since many were simply renamed after the Vikings settled, such as Aorfawick, which became Jorvik. There are parts of the British Isles there were many Viking-style burials, however, and these are found for the most part in Scotland and Ireland, in the areas settled by the Norse. By the time of Guthrum's defeat by Alfred, the Shetland and Orkney Islands had been seized and settled by the Norse.
Bro, you don't have a lot of viewers today. I know, man. I know. I don't know what's been happening lately. I just don't have viewers overall. It's crazy, like legit. But hey, you know what you're gonna do.
The Norse moved further down the western coast of Scotland,
Like 2
conquering the
viewers,
Hebrides before reaching the Isle of Man, Ireland and Wales. In Ireland, the Vikings founded the fortification of Dublin in 841, which was abandoned in 902 and settled again in 917. Due to its central location, Dublin, as it was later known, quickly became an important trading city, particularly in the cargo of slaves. With respect to Anglo-Saxon politics, Dublin was an extremely important centre since it gave the Danes potential
Maybe
allies,
you should
but
try
it's important
Twitch.
to remember that all Vikings were
Yeah,
Danes allies.
maybe I
An
should
example
actually.
being that due to the raiding by the Norse from Dublin, the Danish Northumbrians offered to make an alliance with...
It's just I'm a lot more familiar with YouTube, you know? Like even before opening my own channel, I still did marketing for other people and I became really familiar with the platform of YouTube. So yeah, I should give Twitch a try. It's just sometimes a lack of time, bro, to be honest. But I think I should. I really think I should.
So the Viking position in what would later become England was weakened during the reign of Alfred the Great's successor, Edward the Elder, alongside his sister, Ethelred. Through a series of conflicts, Edward was able to slowly wear away at the borders of the Danish until a series of victories allowed him to annex all of these lands by 918. In 927, Northumbria fell to Edward's successor, Ethelstan, and thus the only remaining Viking powers in the British Isles was that of the Norse. The Norse continued raiding and also occasionally cemented alliances with
all
the British,
over the coast.
such as those of the Kingdom of Strathclyde or the sort of kind of now semi-unified Kingdom of Alba, which would soon become Scotland. Northumbria would not stay under English rule without hiccups, though.
We didn't heard a lot about Caledonia on the past videos.
Over the course of the mid-10th century. The most famous Norse king of York was a man called Eric Bloodaxe. Two things about Eric. One, he had previously been deposed as the King of Norway, and two, his name is awesome but probably wasn't used by his contemporaries.
Eric Bloodaxe.
His first reign began in
That's actually pretty cool.
shortly after Eadred became King of the English. The Northumbrian nobility weren't too keen on being a part of a united England, and they took Eric as their king. In response, Eadred invaded and soon ravaged most of Northumbria, and Eric's supporters abandoned him, presumably because dying is terrible. Eric ran away and was soon replaced by the King of Dublin, Olaf, who reigned between 949 and 952 before himself being kicked out in favour of Eric again. Little is known about what kind of ruler Eric was, but he was ousted again in 954 before being killed in battle. Eadred then took over the ruling of Northumbria.
That's a very Viking way of going out.
Kingdom, and was incorporated into the kingdom of the English. To some, the removal of Eric Bloodaxe marks the end of the Danelaw and the genuine beginning of England as a united political and cultural entity, but there are some problems with this. The first is that Danish law continued to be used long after Northumbria lost its independence. The second is that 954 was not the end of Scandinavian activity in Britain, not by a long shot.
Of course,
Northumbria's loyalty to the House of Wessex was not guaranteed, and many who lived in the old Danelaw were not opposed to the idea of a Danish ruler returning. And the return of a Danish ruler was something they would certainly get. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. If you'd like to know more about the
birth
Danelaw,
of England. Damn. Is this like the literal birth of England?
899, and Alfred the Great
Well,
of
let's
Wessex
go.
is dead. Throughout his life, he built up the kingdom of Wessex from this to this,
that.
managing to turn Mercia into what was essentially a puppet state. Alfred was succeeded by his son, Edward, better known as Edward the Elder, but if you want to be very Anglo-Saxon about it, which you do, his name was Eadweard. Ethelwald, who was the son of Alfred's brother and predecessor Ethelred, revolted against Edward, claiming the throne for himself. Fortunately for Edward, Ethelwald's revolt did not come to much. To summarise, Ethelwald fled Wessex and managed to gain the support of the Danes in East Anglia in attacking Wessex, but he was killed at the Battle of the Holm, which was probably about here. Barring Ethelwald, very little is known about the early reign of King Edward, and information of him doesn't become clear until 911 when Ethelred, the Lord of Mercia, died.
911.
Edward then seized these Mercian lands, which notably included London. Shortly afterwards, he marched into East Anglia and seized all of these lands.
So it's not called Londinium anymore, it's
After
London.
this, Ethelred's widow and Edward's sister, Ethelfled, ruled over Mercia and together with Edward began to put pressure on the neighbouring Danelaw. Over most of the next decade, Ethelfled built fortified burhs across Mercia, many of which were designed to protect against raids from the Norse Vikings based in Dublin and on the Isle of Man. Edward also oversaw the construction of burhs such as the one at Buckingham and one at Malden in his newly conquered territories. The most important year for Anglo-Saxon expansion was 917. Up north, Ethelfled conquered all of this territory, including Derby and its surrounding territories. Shortly afterwards, Edward conquered all of East Anglia and captured the city of Grantebridge, or Cambridge as it's now known. The only remnants of the Danelaw were the Kingdom of York and the remaining 4 of the 5 boroughs. Leicester was the next borough to fall when Ethelfled secured its surrender in 918 without a fight. At this time, the Vikings of York made the offer of an alliance to Ethelfled to defend against Norse raiders, but she died before anything could come of it. Ethelfled's daughter, Elfwin, was supposed to take over as Lady of Mercia, but she was booted out, presumably by Mercians who wanted to retain their independence. This didn't happen.
Ooh, 6 viewers, guys, come on.
Soon after this, Edward ventured into the Danelaw again, and in 918 he took these territories, and by the end of 920 he'd secured the remaining Danish strongholds and expanded his kingdom to all of the land south of the Humber. Those on the periphery of this newly enlarged Anglo-Saxon kingdom found themselves having to choose between resisting or submitting. In 920 or 23, depending on which version you read, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims that the King of the Scots and all the people of the Scots, and Ragnaud and all who lived in Northumbria, both English and Danish, Norsemen or other, and also the King of the Strathclyde Welsh and all the Strathclyde Welsh, chose him as father and lord.
Holy
so
shit.
By the end of Edward's reign, the Kingdom of Wessex looked like this, with roughly these areas pledging allegiance to Edward.
The Scots, the Norse, the Danes, the Welsh,
himself died in 924 and was
Anglo-Saxons,
son,
of course.
Ethelstan, whose best known achievement occurred only 3 years into his reign when he captured the city of York and annexed all of Northumbria, including the non-Danish part. For many, this is considered the birth of England, since the last remaining kingdom with a large population of Anglo-Saxons had been annexed. In the same year as his conquest of Northumbria, Ethelstan received the submission of the King of Scotland and the King of Strathclyde, much like Edward had. The reason for this was that submission was
nice. Like, we saw the birth of France
itself,
with
which meant that these
the
submissions needed
Franks,
to be
and now we're seeing the
peace between
birth of
Ethelstan
England
and
with the
neighbouring kingdoms
Anglo-Saxons.
did not last forever, and in 934 it is known that Ethelstan invaded Scotland. Whether this was in retaliation for something or just an attempt to extend his kingdom is not known, though. None of the neighbouring kingdoms could resist on their own, and so Scotland, Strathclyde and the Kingdom of Dublin formed an alliance, and they met Ethelstan at the Battle of Brunanburh. Brunanburh was extremely bloody.
7 viewers, guys, come on, let's go.
His position as the power in the British Isles. It is considered by
the stream is picking up a little bit, you know.
In Anglo-Saxon history. Ethelstan was not merely a conqueror, though, and his reign saw a change in the nature of Anglo-Saxon government. Anglo-Saxon society was one dominated by the aristocracy and one with many social ranks. There were many nuances, but
Royalty,
the nobility consisted
peasantry,
primarily of two major
slaves.
ranks. The first was the ealdorman, who was generally in charge of a province called a shire, but some ealdormen held several. The other major rank of nobility was that of the thane, who held smaller groups of lands. Both noble ranks had obligations to the king, such as providing troops, dispensing justice, building and maintaining bridges, as well as providing the church. In return for fulfilling these duties, nobles would expect rewards such as lands and privileges. The bulk of society consisted of
That's
lay
rare,
people,
right?
the main group
That
being
never
free peasants
happens.
called churls. Ethelstan's reign was also a period which saw an increase in Anglo-Saxon involvement in continental affairs. For example, when the West Frankish king Charles the Simple was deposed and imprisoned, his son Louis was given refuge. Ethelstan then helped the exiled Louis return to West Francia to take the throne and helped to keep him there. Another exiled prince called Hakon was helped by Ethelstan to take the throne of Norway from his older brother Eric. Thus, Eric was exiled and fled to the British Isles and would eventually become a problem. Ethelstan wouldn't live to see this though, since he died in 939. He was succeeded by his half-brother Edmund, who had to deal almost immediately
That's
with
a very
Norse
English
invasion
name,
led by a man
Edmund.
called Olaf Guthrufsson. Olaf seized York and invaded the Midlands, forcing Edmund to recognise him as the king of Northumbria and the sovereign of these lands. Olaf continued the long trend of Viking mortality and died in 941 and was succeeded by his cousin, also called Olaf. Soon after, Edmund began a reconquest of his lost territories. In 942 he retook the Midlands, and in 944 he drove Olaf out of Northumbria. Having reunited the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, Edmund invaded the neighbouring kingdom of Strathclyde in 945 and basically set everything on fire. He took some of its southern lands but agreed to give overlordship of Strathclyde to King Malcolm I of Scotland. As a result of the conquest of the Danes,
Was it
Edmund
called
became known
Scotland,
as the liberator
or-
of the Danes, since apparently he'd rescued them from the harsh rule of the Norse, but the exact details of Norse rule are lost to time. Edmund's reign ended abruptly in 946 when he was either murdered by a thief or assassinated, no one knows for sure. Edmund was succeeded by his younger brother, Eadred, and shortly after this, in 947, the previously exiled Eric from Norway, better known as Eric Bloodaxe, conquered Northumbria. Eadred, Eric, and the previously driven out Olaf struggled for Northumbria over the next 7 years, but in the end, Eadred decisively defeated Eric and reclaimed all of Northumbria. After this, Northumbria would permanently remain a constituent part of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom and later England. Not much else is known about Eadred's reign, which came to an end upon his death in 955. Eadred was succeeded by his nephew, the 15-year-old Eadwy, who immediately had a falling out with a prominent abbot called Dunstan, who subsequently fled to Flanders. Eadwy's reign was one plagued with the issues of loyalty. Not much is known about the exact quarrels, but a faction against King Eadwy was formed.
You
which
have to be
favoured his
king at
brother
15
Edgar for the
years
throne.
old.
In 957, the ealdormen of East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria declared for Edgar. Civil war was avoided when it was agreed by the nobility that the kingdom would be split. Eadwy would retain Wessex, whereas Edgar would get the rest, which seemed fair. This division wouldn't last long, since Eadwy died 2 years later at the ripe old age of 19, and Edgar took over the entire kingdom. So Edgar is mostly known for the numerous reforms he undertook, both political and ecclesiastical. Edgar was not a conqueror like Alfred, Edward or Ethelstan, but he had the difficult task of keeping the newly formed Anglo-Saxon kingdom together and strengthening the king's hold over them. Much of this was done via legal codes and charters, and interestingly, Edgar allowed the laws previously established in the Danelaw to remain in force. The reason for this was that forcing Anglo-Saxon laws onto an Anglo-Danish population could have caused resentment and potentially rebellion. Governing the realm was undertaken by the Viteniamot, which was a large royal council of nobles and churchmen which met regularly and decided on important matters of state such as the succession of kings and the passing of laws. This council travelled all around the kingdom instead of staying at the capital of Winchester. Under Edgar, the status of ealdormen increased, but they still had important administrative positions. Ealdormen were appointed by the king and they held a shire for life. The position wasn't hereditary though, and upon the death of an ealdorman, the land went back to the king to redistribute as he saw fit. The shire was the backbone of the administrative system, and the system implemented by Edgar lasted until its abolition in 1974. The shire was divided into hundreds or wapentakes if in the old areas of the Danelaw, which had their own courts which met monthly and was the unit of land used to assess the raising of troops. Shockingly, the hundred was made up of 100 hides of land with the exception of Wessex where it varied. The hundred was divided into the tithing, which was made up of 10 hides and the households that lived upon them. Edgar's reforms were also economic, and he oversaw the standardization of the
stuff, alright guys?
in 973. It was ordered that the coins were to be replaced every 6 years in order to reduce counterfeiting, and that the coins had to bear the place it was minted and the moneyer in charge of the mint on the back of their coins. Probably the most famous reform from Edgar's reign was his monastic reform. Almost immediately after he became king, he recalled the abbot Dunstan, who became the Bishop of Worcester before becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury. Dunstan, along with Ethelred, the Bishop of Winchester, and Oswald, the Archbishop of...
I love those old English names, dude. I don't know what you would call this letter, like Ethelred, but it's pretty awesome.
With the monasteries.
To simplify, it was believed that the holy houses were not sufficiently pious anymore, partly due to laziness
They
and
weren't
partly due to the
pious.
fact that Vikings kept burning them down. During his exile, Dunstan came into contact with the European-wide Benedictine reform movement, which sought to restore the highly structured lifestyles of monks. Edgar provided a great deal of land and money towards this reform, although some of it was seized from his nobles. Land grants and donations were used to found new monasteries whose residents adhered to the reformed rules, which were codified in a document called the Regularis Concordia. Whilst Edgar's reforms were important, Edgar's biggest achievement was keeping the Anglo-Saxon kingdom together. After Edgar, the unity of the kingdom was very secure. The nobility was more secure in their position, there had been decades of peace, and the kingdom's finances were much more stable. Edgar wasn't coronated king until the year 973, when he was 30 years old and 16 years into his reign. Shortly after this, the other kings within Britain came to Chester to personally pledge their allegiance to him. Edgar would only remain king for another 2 years when he died, leaving behind 2 young sons, Edward and Ethelred, who both had their backers. Edward won out.
Oh, so I guess this is what you're talking, huh? So Edgar's reign was a time of peace and growth before it went wrong under his sons, and yeah, he was just getting to his sons.
3 years into his reign, he was invited to see his brother and stepmother Alfred in Corfe, where he was swiftly murdered upon his arrival, after which he was remembered as Edward the Martyr. His brother succeeded him as King Ethelred II, but he is better known as Ethelred the Unready, whose unfortunate legacy will be examined next week.
The Unready, man.
Thank you for watching. There are some book recommendations.
All right. Does he actually have book recommendations in this one? Yeah, he does. Good. I wish I could. You know what? I'm gonna give him a look. The late Anglo-Saxons and King Canute. I don't know how you would pronounce that, but
King Edward the Martyr has been successfully martyred.
Let's go.
Ethelred II, his younger brother, who is better known as Ethelred the Unready, succeeded him. Side note about this.
Imagine being called or being remembered as the Unready. I think this gives me a little bit of a clue of what's going to happen.
This was used during Ethelred's lifetime, and second, it's actually a play on words. In Old English, Ethelred means wise counsel, and Unred means bad counsel. So his name actually means wise counsel, the poorly counselled, because as will become evident, he trusted the wrong people. So ascending the throne after your mother probably orchestrated the assassination of your predecessor is not a very good place to start. This was not Ethelred's only problem, since many of the nobles who had their lands given to the church by Ethelred's father, King Edgar, wanted them back, and many just simply took them. This placed Ethelred right in the middle of a conflict between the church and the nobility. Unfortunately for Ethelred, an even bigger threat to his kingdom re-emerged during his reign. The Vikings. The Vikings began raiding shortly after Ethelred became king. This was small scale until the later 10th century, when Viking raids became significantly more deadly. The root of the change from small scale to large comes from Denmark, which at the beginning of Ethelred's reign was ruled by Harold Bluetooth, who also ruled Norway. Harold had professionalized the Danish army, and by the time he was deposed by his son, Sweyn Forkbeard in 986,
sometimes I act like a 16-year-old.
In 991, Ethelred signed a treaty with Richard, the Duke of Normandy, which stipulated that neither would allow the Vikings to use each other's ports to resupply. This didn't do much to deter the Vikings, since they launched their first major attack against the Anglo-Saxons in the same year. They were met at Maldon, which is here, by the elder man Britnoth, who was defeated, and his efforts were immortalised in the Old English poem, The Battle of Maldon. In response to the defeat, Ethelred was advised to pay the Vikings off. This technically worked since they did leave, but the irony was that since the Vikings could now simply turn up and be paid a huge sum of money, it meant that Ethelred's kingdom became a much more valuable target. So the sums paid to the Vikings were absolutely massive.
So did it actually work?
To the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the first tribute was 10,000 pounds of silver or other things of equivalent value. The only reason that the English were able to raise so much money was because of how centralised the kingdom had become over the previous century. The reforms had allowed the king's officials, notably shire reeves, to collect taxes efficiently. The idea to pay off the Vikings came from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Sigeric, who himself had to pay off the Vikings to prevent them from burning down the cathedral at Canterbury. Ethelred's Viking trouble was compounded with the problems he had with his nobility. Many of the Viking raids were occurring in lands which had only recently been added to the kingdom, and the loyalties of said lands' lords were still shaky.
Well, questionable,
to keep the kingdom together, Ethelred made many donations of lands to the ealdormen from outside Wessex, making them much more influential. The year 1002 saw two major events. The first was that Ethelred married Richard of Normandy's sister, Emma, and this was the start of the close relationship between the Anglo-Saxon kings and the Dukes of Normandy. The second was the St. Brice's Day massacre. This was an order given by Ethelred to slaughter all of the Danes within his kingdom on the 13th of November. The fact that this order was given implies that there was a genuine terror felt over the threat the Danes posed. Naturally, this order wasn't genuinely enforceable, since large swathes of the kingdom were made up of Danes, but many massacres were carried out and the loss of life was huge. It is likely that the invasion in 1003 by King Sweyn Forkbeard was a response to the massacre which may have taken the life of his sister. Sweyn landed in East Anglia and sacked the city of Norwich, but the fighting against the English was costly, and so in 1005 he returned to Denmark. The next year he was back and ransacked the south of the kingdom before being bought off, this time...
Yeah, exactly. That's the same thing I thought, the more you pay the Vikings, the more they're going to use that leverage to get more money. And it's easier for them because they also don't have to use guns or more people, more lives. They just show up and make a threat. And if you don't pay, they it would have been much easier if you fight them. And you could have defeated them, I guess.
With 36,000.
But yeah, you're absolutely right.
To be better prepared for future
it sort of reminds me of appeasement, like they were trying to appease the Vikings, but it only sort of made it worse. Shit, I'm like hearing noises outside and stuff.
The building of a large fleet of 300 ships. Unfortunately for Ethelred, the next year there was a dispute between two ealdormen, a certain Eadric Straeoner of Mercia and another called
Noble
Wulfnoth.
disputes.
Things got out of hand.
They're
Wulfnoth
never
stole
easy.
20 ships, Eadric followed with 80, ran them ashore, and Wulfnoth ended up burning them. Thus, the new navy, due to a petty dispute, was shrank by a third, meaning it wouldn't be able to stop a Viking fleet if one turned up. Well, one did turn up soon
I want to
after,
see the
led
birth
not
of
by
the
Sweyn,
Royal
but by
Navy,
Thorkel the Tall. Thorkel and his men ravaged many parts of the country.
By the way, I'm sorry for not adding any interesting commentary, but I'm very ignorant about this part of European history in general, and of course, much more so with English history. So I just don't really know anything. I'm just learning.
Including Oxford. In 1011, Thorkel laid siege to Canterbury and seized the city along with the archbishop there, Elfheah, who he tried to ransom. Elfheah
That's a
refused
beautiful
to be
name,
ransomed,
Elfheah.
and so some of Thorkel's men murdered him. Thorkel, like most of the Vikings at this time, was a Christian and was either disgusted with the murder or believed he could no longer control his men, and so took the troops most loyal to him and defected to fight for Ethelred. The Viking invasions overshadowed most of Ethelred's reign, but he was responsible for continuing administrative reform and issuing laws which he upheld strictly, very strictly. Ethelred's most famous law code is known as the Wantage Code, which notably set up a local body of 12 thanes who would preside over trials and decide on a charged man's innocence or guilt. Some consider this to be the origin of the jury, but be aware that many dispute this. Reforms aside, Ethelred's main concern was still the Vikings, and in 1013 Sweyn Forkbeard returned. Many of the old areas of the Danelaw accepted Sweyn as their king almost immediately, and by the end of the year, Ethelred had fled to Normandy, and Sweyn was now the king of the English, Norway, and Denmark. Sweyn thus began his long and prosperous reign, which lasted for 5 whole weeks before he died. The nobles negotiated for Ethelred to return, providing he abided by certain rules and was a better ruler. The Danish army weren't going to allow this, and they declared Sweyn's son, Canute, as king. Ethelred managed to drive Canute away fairly quickly, but he returned in 1015 with a much larger army. Ethelred's son, Edmund, who fought most of the battles against Canute, was
Another Edmund.
rebellion against his father and was in control of a sizable portion of the kingdom. To make matters worse, the ealdorman Eadric of Mercia betrayed Ethelred and joined Canute. Ethelred died in April 1016 and his son was declared king. However, after many losses, Edmund agreed to divide the kingdom between himself and Canute, but this didn't last since Edmund died in November of the same year.
Look at that. Very fair partition of a kingdom, huh? Well, I guess it returned to the old shape of Wessex.
Thus, Canute received the entire kingdom and was the first monarch to title himself as the King of England, as opposed to the title used by his Anglo-Saxon predecessors, King of the English. So Canute is most famous for commanding the tide to stop
England,
on the,
the land of the English.
For this, he's often portrayed as being a bit mad. But
they should be the real birth of
England. To show
England.
that even a king's power pales in comparison to God's. So soon after he became king, Canute took the liberty of murdering any English noble he didn't like, such as Eadric, presumably because of the whole betraying his previous king thing. Canute also raised a colossal amount of money to pay off the army which had won him the throne, which placed the kingdom under further strain. This strain is evidenced by the fact that also in 1018 the Scottish invaded and managed to seize all of this territory. Soon after this, Canute's older brother Harold died and Canute inherited Denmark. After gaining Denmark, Canute had to balance the needs.
I fucking hate the Scottish accent of English. It's very hard to understand, as a foreigner and as a non-English speaker, non-native English speaker. Just extremely hard. Like the few times I've talked with someone of Scotland, just like, man, I have no idea what you're saying.
Each of his kingdoms,
Literally, I have no idea, zero idea.
Denmark. During his first trip there,
I'm
Canute
sorry
sent a
if
letter
you're from
addressed to the English
Scotland.
people in which he declares that he will be a just ruler, but importantly, he stated that, I went myself with the men who accompanied me to Denmark, and I have taken measures so that never henceforth shall hostility reach you from there, as long as you support me rightly and as long as my life lasts. So Canute was offering the English peace against the Vikings, which was something England had not had in many decades.
Yeah,
Canute
no
also
more
made a
raids.
show of continuity by first
Imagine
marrying
that. No more Viking raids. They must have felt pretty great.
Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, although side note, he actually had two wives, the second being a Mercian lady called Elfgifu. Alongside marrying the widowed queen, Canute continued to use the laws of the previous Anglo-Saxon kings, most notably those of Edgar. This doesn't mean that he didn't change the way the kingdom was run, however. Canute divided the kingdom into 4 earldoms, which would be run by his trusted earls. The earldoms were Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria and East Anglia. Initially,
Sounds
Wessex, which
familiar.
held England's capital of Winchester, was directly under Canute's rule, but towards the end of his reign in the 1030s, Canute appointed an Englishman called Godwin as the Earl of Wessex. One major legacy of the division of England into earldoms was that it concentrated land and wealth into the hands of very few people, and a weak king could potentially be challenged by one of his earls. Spoiler alert, this happens. Another change was that Canute established a group of bodyguards called housecarls who also acted as the king's emissaries and importantly were very expensive to maintain since there were several thousand of them. In 1028, Canute also managed to gain.
I'll talk about it. Let's finish this video and
looking a bit scary. In 1035, Canute died, leaving the succession open to multiple potential heirs. Canute had wanted the son he'd had with Queen Emma, Harthacnut, to succeed him, but Harthacnut was busy in Denmark fighting a rebellion. To make things more complicated, Canute's son from his first marriage, Harold, better known as Harold Harrowfoot, was the only potential heir in England. Two sides formed concerning who should succeed Canute. Canute's first wife, Elfgifu, and the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria favoured Harold, whereas Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Queen Emma favoured Harthacnut. The fact that women like Emma and Elfgifu were extremely influential was down to the culture of Anglo-Saxon England. In other European societies, women had significantly less power and rights than in Anglo-Saxon England. This does not mean that women were seen as equals, since they absolutely were not, but unlike other kingdoms, women could own, inherit and dispose of property, which meant
that is something.
They could act as witnesses for trials and charters, and if
if I'm not mistaken, on the founding of America, like women couldn't own property. If I'm not mistaken, maybe I'm wrong, and we're talking about 1776. So
victims of crimes, the compensation
that's
for them was
pretty
the same
cool.
as men. Earl Godwin and Emma eventually realised that Harthacnut wasn't going to show and so accepted Harold as their king. For many of the nobles, the return of an English king would mean that they were open to invasion by the Vikings again.
More raids.
In fact, the payment of tribute to the Vikings, known as the Geld, was Europe's only general land tax, which applied to everyone, peasant and noble alike, which shows how centralised the government was and how afraid of the Vikings they were. In 1037, Harold was coronated as king, but his reign for the most part was uneventful, and it is believed that his mother was the real power behind the throne. Harold died in 1040, and the nobles of England invited Harthacnut to become king, which he did, but not after arriving with an army, just to be sure. This army, much like Canute's, needed paying, so more geld was raised. Harthacnut's reign was very short, and he died in 1042, but it's important to remember that that was common, since of the 12 kings who ruled a united England up until this point, 8 ruled for less than a decade, and 6 died under the age of 30. Harthacnut was the last Scandinavian to rule England,
The House
to mark
of
the end
Denmark.
of the Royal House of Denmark and the return of the Royal House of Wessex. I hope you enjoyed this
That's
episode.
good,
Thank
I
you for
guess.
watching.
And,
If you'd like to know more, then
having another English or Anglo-Saxon on the throne. A place in history I want to learn more about is Central and South America. Before the Spanish and Portuguese turned up, like what was happening in 800 and 1300 AD. It's interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. Especially because you have like 2 very big empires. In Mexico, or what is now today Mexico, there was the Aztec Empire. Just a massive, powerful, it was a very militarized indigenous empire. And like the name suggests, it was an empire. So it was like based on what we now is Mexico City, but it had conquered a lot of the tribes surrounding it. And you also had in like what's today Peru in South America, the Inca Empire, which I don't know much about the Inca Empire, but they were like very wealthy. They had a lot of gold, very modernized, had a really good army, all across the coast of Peru. So in Mexico, for example, I think the Aztecs and the Mayans in the coast of Yucatan were going to go to war, but then the Spanish arrived and, it had to happen later. So 1066 and the Norman Conquest. Then the conquest of Norman, is it like Normandy? But yeah, it's interesting, you know. I wish I could also learn more about like pre-Columbian history in the Americas. I know, of course, the Mexican history or the Mexican side in history and how the Aztecs were like burning Mayan cities, for example. Uh, and of course, what's my forte, if you could call it, it's like Colombian America and what happened next. The independence movement in Latin America, Mexico, and others. So it's interesting. It's cool.
Is without a king.
It's not as
The last king,
mythical as
Harthacnut,
English
didn't have
history,
any heirs,
but
so in the previous year he had invited Edward, the son of the last
definitely very
Anglo-Saxon
cool.
king, Ethelred II, from his exile in Normandy to stay at the English court. Shortly after the death of Harthacnut, Edward was chosen as king by the nobles, notably by Earl Godwin of Wessex, the most powerful in the kingdom. There were several other claimants, though, such as Edward,
Día de
the
la
son of Edmund
Hispanidad.
Ironside, as well as King Magnus
I'm
of
sorry,
Norway,
bro.
who just
No sé
succeeded
qué estás
Harthacnut
hablando,
to the
amigo.
Danish throne. Edward's reign marks the high
Shit,
point
it's
of
kind of weird to
Anglo-Saxon
talk in
administration,
Spanish.
which is best demonstrated by a new form of legal document, the writ.
On stream,
Edward
of course.
was not
I
the
talk
first king to
Spanish
use
like
a writ,
most
but
of
he
the
did use
time.
them widely. The writ was a short notice that land had been traded which was sent to shire reeves to be authenticated and witnessed. All of this relied on a detailed record-keeping system and a well-trained bureaucracy which
Turns out you're
regularly
rich.
assessed the values of land. The assessment of lands was the foundation for the English army, which over
Okay,
the
this is
previous
important.
century had become more professional. For every 5 hides of land, a single fully equipped soldier had to be provided. 5 hides were the minimum amount of land a man could possess to become a thane, so every thane had to provide at least 1 soldier for the English army. Equipping a soldier was expensive, so this created a prestigious warrior class. Edward, better known as Edward the Confessor, is one of the few English kings that became a saint.
It's interesting because we were talking about the Aztec Empire, and they also had a privileged warrior
Abbey in London,
class.
Westminster Abbey, which was designed by Norman architects using a continental building style. As king, Edward had a lot of say over church matters, such as the appointing of bishops and archbishops, and this was the beginning of one of his reign's most important events. In 1050, the
Oh, yeah. Columbus Day. I'm sorry. I had like... Yeah, here in Mexico, we just call it Columbus Day. It's very controversial. I think it's more controversial in the U.S. Like people here in Mexico, we don't celebrate Columbus Day, but we also like don't care about it. It's like, okay, today's Columbus Day. Like, who cares? But I think in the U.S. it's like extremely controversial. I don't know if you guys want my opinion on it. But I'm not a huge fan of Columbus Day, to be
Archbishop
honest.
of Canterbury, Eadsiger, died, and in 1051 a monk called Ethelred was chosen by the monks of Canterbury to succeed him. Edward forbid this from happening and appointed a Norman called Robert to the position instead, which angered Earl Godwin since Ethelred was a relative of his. In order to become the archbishop, Robert had to collect what was called a pallium, a symbol of his office, from Rome personally. It is argued by Norman sources that whilst on his way, Robert stopped off in Normandy and told William, the Duke of Normandy, that since Edward had no heirs, he wished for William to succeed him. Now, this is debated fiercely, but it lays the foundation for William's later claim to the throne of England. Edward, in order to secure a continental alliance, received Count Eustace of Boulogne, which is here, as a guest in 1051. He gave Eustace some land in Dover, and upon his arrival there, Eustace got into a quarrel with the locals and some people were killed. Edward blamed the locals and so ordered Godwin to
the
harry
first
that,
invasions of
devastating,
England
as
to
punishment.
France.
Godwin refused because
Gosh,
he owned a
this is
significant portion
history,
of Dover
bro.
and
This
didn't want
is...
to break his own stuff. Godwin thus raised an army against the king, and the king summoned Siward, the Earl of Northumbria, and Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, against him. Side note about Leofric, he is most famous for his part in the legend of his wife, Lady Godiva. The legend goes that Leofric was oppressive, and his wife asked him to lessen the taxes on the poor. Leofric told Godiva that he would do this on the condition...
I mean, a lot of Americans might know this, but there's a very famous chocolate brand called Godiva. Which say, it's okay.
Naked, which she promptly did. So, folklore aside, England was on the brink of civil war until Godwin's support collapsed and he was forced to flee and he was never seen again. Just kidding. So Godwin returned the next year with a fleet and demanded concessions from the king, such as the banishment of the Archbishop Robert, as well as some of the Normans at court. The king acquiesced, and Godwin returned to his earldom, with one of his loyal men, Stigand, becoming Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Winchester. Godwin's triumph wouldn't end since he died in
I don't care about the controversy, I just want to have a free day. Well, yeah, same, bro, same.
Shockingly, he was the son of Godwin, succeeded his father as the Earl of Wessex. Harold's position was entrenched further when his brother Tostig became the Earl of Northumbria in 1055, and at roughly the same time another of his brothers, Geath, was made the Earl of East
Are we
Anglia.
far from
Tostig
Henry
wouldn't
VIII?
last forever
Yeah,
as
we're
the
kind
Earl
of far.
Northumbria, though, since he was driven out by the people there in 1065. A man called Morcar was made Earl of Northumbria, who was the younger brother of Edwin, the Earl of Mercia. Thus, by the end of 1065, the 4 major earldoms were split between 2 powerful families. In the same year, it is said that Harold went to Normandy in behalf of the now sick Edward to uphold the earlier promise that William was to succeed as King of England. On January the 6th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died. On the same day, Harold Godwinson was crowned King Harold II. He may have been crowned king, but there was no guarantee that he would stay king. What was guaranteed now was that there would be a battle between the claimants to the kingdom. There were only two rivals to Harold, the first being William and the second being the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, whose claim was based upon an alleged agreement that had been made with Harthacnut. The English began preparing for William's coming invasion, and King Harold had his army camp in the southern shires. Unfortunately for him, Hardrada landed on the Northumbrian coast on the 18th of September, helped by the exiled Tostig. The Earls of Mercia and Northumbria met Hardrada at the Battle of Fulford on September the 20th. The Norwegians were victorious, and soon after, Hardrada was in control of York. Godwinson soon after marched his army north at an incredible rate, and on September the 25th, both kings fought at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The English were victorious, and during the fighting, Hardrada was killed due to being shot through the neck with an arrow. Godwinson and his army were given little time to recover, since on either the 28th or the 29th of September, William's fleet and army landed here. Howard rushed his exhausted army down south to meet William. On October the 14th, they clashed at the famous Battle of Hastings, in which Godwinson was killed. Probably the best known source from the period is the Bayeux Tapestry. It was probably commissioned by William's half-brother Otto and was made in England, not Bayeux. It also isn't a tapestry but an embroidery, meaning that in a name consisting of two words, both are lies. William awaited the English to proclaim him as his king, but instead many nobles backed a native called Edgar, who was the grandson of a previous king, Edmund Ironside. This initial resistance did not achieve much, and William soon accepted London's surrender, and by late October most of the English nobles had given up. William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on December the 25th, although the coronation had its hiccups. When asked if they wanted William as their king, the people outside the abbey all cheered.
God damn.
Which the Norman guards couldn't understand, and according to William of Poitiers, the guards thought that the shouting boded some ill, and without reason they started to set fire to the city. The coronation was still completed, but it was always to be remembered as the one with the most arson. William did not stay in England long, and in 1067 he returned to Normandy in triumph, leaving his brother Otto in charge. There were many revolts against Norman rule in the wake of the conquest. One of the most famous rebels is a man called Hereward the Wake, who led a guerrilla-style campaign against the Normans from Ely, which included slaughtering knights and looting Peterborough Abbey with the help of some Danes. Rebellion was intermittent over the next couple of years, but the Normans were able to effectively deal with them due to one innovation that the Normans had brought with them: the castle. The Normans used a specific type of castle called a motte and bailey, which shockingly consisted of a bailey, which was a fortified courtyard sitting next to a motte, which was a large earthen mound with a keep on top. They were designed to allow the Norman soldiers and nobles to live among their subjects from a defensible position, and if their subjects got a bit rebellious, the soldiers could simply go out, crush them, and return to safety. In 1068, William appointed a man called Robert Comine as the Earl of Northumbria, but the next year he and his guards were murdered by the locals. Unsurprisingly, William was furious, and so began an infamous period in British history known as the Harrying of the North, which involved Norman troops under William undertaking a scorched earth policy. They burned crops, attacked peasants, and destroyed villages in order to flush out the rebels who refused to meet William in battle. The results were devastating for the North, and it is believed that over 100,000 people were killed in the several months it lasted. So it's hard to overstate the colossal effect that the Norman Conquest had on the Kingdom of England and the people that lived there. In order to promote continuity,
is this
William
the Conqueror?
English, but it wasn't long before it was replaced by Latin. He did continue the Guild though, since it was extremely lucrative, but for the most part the attempts at continuity were short-lived. The ruling class
I think he is,
for all
right?
intents and purposes eradicated, with very few maintaining their positions in the decade after the conquest. William saw that the overwhelming majority of the English nobility was replaced by his closest friends and allies. Within 10 years of the conquest, no Englishman held an earldom, only one English bishop remained, and over 90% of land had been confiscated for redistribution. William appointed a man called Lanfranc as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Lanfranc's main change was to begin the curtailing of the reverence of Anglo-Saxon saints.
Your
Culturally,
saints
the
are
change was
fake.
massive too. Old English names such as the Ethelreds, the Edgeberts, and the Leofrics were replaced with Roberts, Henrys, and Williams.
No. I love those old English names. No more Ethelred? Ethelred? Gosh, this sucks. Many English people still hate William the Conqueror for what he did. Views on his descendants are mixed. I wonder what could have been if Harold Godwinson had won against William. Yeah, it's true, man.
Were replaced with Roberts, Henrys, and Williams. Women
Fuck
restricted
that,
the rights
man.
they were entitled to under Anglo-Saxon
Bring back
law,
the
and
old
free
English
peasants,
names.
The churls lost much of their status as well. This
But
does not mean
it's
that
an
the English were
interesting
entirely
thought
unimportant.
exercise.
It is likely that Englishmen made up most of the warrior class, and
You
maybe
may
the
die
reason
from
why the
yeah,
English
shut
word
up,
knight
man.
continued to be used instead of its French equivalent, chevalier.
So William the Conqueror is
Architecture
not
also saw
a
massive
popular
rise,
guy in
the
England,
stoic
huh?
Anglo-Saxon features being replaced by the much more extravagant Romanesque architecture the Normans had brought with them. So were there any benefits? Yes, some. The Norman conquest would eventually lead to the abolition of slavery, which was very common in
good, I
Anglo-Saxon
guess.
England. The Norman nobles felt that slavery was barbaric and it soon fell out of fashion.
I mean, it
and would
was.
eventually disappear within 50 years. The Normans also had a very competent government, and their efforts culminated in the creation of the Domesday Book in 1086, which was a survey of England's wealth and is one of the most important sources for the period. For the most part, the lives of the peasantry remained unchanged, and the Normans, along with their Flemish allies, were able to prevent a great deal of Viking raiding, and by 1085 the genuine threat of a Viking takeover was history. Of course, arguably the greatest consequence of the Norman takeover was that the affairs of England and France would be, from 1066 onwards, closely intertwined, since from that point forward the Duke of Normandy, the subject of the French king, was now the king of a wealthier, separate kingdom which would only lead to conflict. This conflict and those that came after would drastically alter the course of history for both of these kingdoms for the next 1,000 years. Prior to Hastings, the kingdoms of England and France had been on good terms. William may have won in the end, but had Harold Hardrada simply turned up a mere 3 weeks later, England could have become a very different nation. It would not be an exaggeration to call October the 14th, 1066
yeah, that's
the
true,
most important
Edward.
date in English history.
One of the old
there
English
have been many
names.
events of immense importance, but the date of them will slip most people's minds. But not Hastings. 1066 is a date that will forever be burned into the English consciousness. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some book recommendations in the description if you'd like to know more.
This is episode 8. Where's the playlist? Well, here we go.
10-8.
Let me just go very quickly to the bathroom. I'm not even gonna put like the I'll come later, you know? Well, howdy, howdy. It's interesting that every time I go to the bathroom, like the viewers increases. But yeah, we were watching the not so cool William conquering England, so it's a really interesting thought exercise to imagine what would have happened without the conquest of England.
86.
But yeah,
England has a new king,
the
and
very
a new royal family.
famous
This
rivalry
new king
between
was
France and
William,
England.
better known as William the Conqueror, and he was now
Yeah.
indisputably in charge. The next year he died, which caused problems, mostly for William due to the whole being dead thing, but also because of the succession. Norman inheritance law was complicated, but essentially the father would give to the eldest son what he himself had inherited, and whatever he had gained in life he could distribute however he saw fit. William's eldest son was Robert, who under this law gained Normandy.
Weird English.
William's second eldest son was also called William, and he inherited England, becoming William II, but he's better known as William Rufus. Henry, William's third son, just got a wad of cash and no land. So being king is objectively better than being a duke, and so unsurprisingly Robert was none too happy with his younger brother now being his superior. So at first both Robert and William agreed to be each other's heirs, but this agreement broke down in 1088. This was when Robert, with the help of his barons, attempted to overthrow William so that he could be king. The Norman barons were faced with the issue of owning lands in both Normandy and England. This meant that if the brothers came to blows, the nobles would certainly have had their lands confiscated in one place or the other. The barons wanted England and Normandy to be united politically so that it was easier for them to concentrate on the external threats to their holdings, which at this point were the King of France and the Duke of Anjou. The disagreement between the brothers is known as the Baronial Rebellion of 1088 due to the number of nobles that picked Robert over William. It included widespread raiding across southern England, but the king eventually won out by coercing some lords to rejoin him and by capturing the leader of the revolt, Otto, who was banished thereafter. During this rebellion against him, William Rufus had to deal with an invasion from the Scottish king Malcolm III. William was busy fighting in Normandy and so had to return to England, but Malcolm quickly signed a treaty before any real retaliation could happen. The relationship between
resisted
England
a lot
and
of
Scotland during this
invasions
period
from the
was
Scottish, the
complicated and can
Vikings,
essentially
the
be summed up
French.
as an uneasy stalemate. Scotland lacked the manpower to conquer England, and Scotland's terrain made it too expensive for an English army to hold, and thus the stalemate would continue. William and Malcolm ended up coming to blows again in 1091, when Malcolm invaded England but was quickly stopped, and after this the kingdoms entered a period of prolonged peace and mutual love. Or perhaps not, since in 1093 the Scottish ravaged the lands of Northumbria. The Earl of Northumbria, presumably annoyed at his lands being destroyed, ambushed King Malcolm later the same year here at a place called Alnwick. The ambush saw King Malcolm and his son and heir Edward killed, thus ending the war and plunging Scotland into a dynastic crisis. William's issues with his brother were ended in 1095 not by a military victory but by a stroke of luck when Pope Urban II began to preach for a crusade to retake the holy city of Jerusalem. Duke Robert now had an easy way out, which could potentially win him his own lands as well as some glory. Robert thus leased Normandy to William in order to finance his part in the First Crusade. This fortunate timing by the church ended one of William's disputes, but another was still raging, that of his relationship with the church and specifically Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anselm believed that the church did not answer to the king but to God through the Pope. This belief that churchmen owed no allegiance to any secular power did not sit well with William. Both argued for many years, and in 1097 Anselm was exiled and ended up in Rome. The next 3 years of William's reign were fairly secure and his power remained unchallenged. In 1100, Robert was on his way back from the Crusades, having won glory and also a wealthy wife on the way back, and it seemed that conflict between Robert and William was looming. In the same year, William went hunting with his younger brother Henry, during which he was killed in an
we still have a lot of videos to cover. We're just at 9.
Suspicious. Before William's body was cold, Henry had seized Winchester, which held the royal treasury, and was soon after coronated as King Henry I. Henry had to move quickly to secure the loyalty of his lords and prevent his returning brother from overthrowing him. On the day of his coronation, Henry issued what is called the Charter of Liberties, in which he essentially repealed the unpopular laws of his brother.
Oh, and you have to imagine, these are brothers, okay? These are not like people who don't know each other or rival kings. These are brothers, dude.
As a noble heir having to
William the Conqueror.
This is a good place to explain just how the politics of the nobility worked during the Norman period. The main thing to remember here is that a lord did not own his lands, but instead they were leased from the king in return for their loyal service and payment. These lords could in turn lease these lands to lesser lords, who would lease them in turn to the peasants who worked them. The centrality of land to English life is hard to overstate. To the aristocracy, clergy and the monarchy it was a source of income and authority, but to everyone else, king and peasant alike, it provided everything necessary for medieval life. Its most obvious output was food, and feeding the kingdom required the vast majority of the labour force to be committed to agriculture. Even with this commitment, the amount of food produced was not much over subsistence. Agriculture thus made up the vast majority of England's economy. It had little in the way of raw materials to export, and besides that, the most lucrative of Europe's trade at this time was centred on the Mediterranean. Importantly, the fact that everyday life relied so much on agriculture meant that when there were major crop failures, and there were many, it meant that people simply starved. So back to politics. Robert, having returned to Normandy, gathered some of his nobles and soon after arrived in England, landing in Portsmouth here. Many English nobles, including the powerful Robert of Boleyn, flocked to Duke Robert's side, preparing to overthrow Henry. There was no battle, and instead the brothers agreed that Henry would remain king but had to pay his brother an annual sum. Henry then moved against Boleyn,
sounds like a fair deal,
and banishing him. This was done under the pretext of Boleyn's unauthorised conquest of parts of Wales and the building of castles there. The reason for this is that not just anyone was allowed to build castles, since the rebellious
He hasn't talked about Wales very much.
Expensive. Soon after this, Duke Robert allied with the exiled Boleyn, and Henry saw this as a betrayal, and in 1105 he invaded Normandy. In 1106, Henry met his brother at the Battle of Tantrambre, which saw Duke Robert captured, after which he would spend the last 28 years of his life in captivity. Henry's reign was not all military. Like his brother, he had some trouble with the church.
35 years.
The exiled Archbishop of Canterbury had returned to England in 1100 and had importantly supported Henry's claim over his older brothers. This did not mean that the two were good friends or anything, since having spent a couple of years in Rome, Anselm had become acquainted with the official church policy on the appointment of bishops. The position of the Pope was that only he could appoint bishops, since kings were simply lay people concerned with lesser earthly things, and that the popes were concerned with greater heavenly issues. Unsurprisingly,
it's the
this
Pope,
did not
man.
please Henry, since
what else is
going to important church positions was an important way of making allies. There was some bickering between the two, and despite the king officially agreeing to the demands, his say-so was still very important in deciding who would be appointed. It was only a technical concession, but importantly, Henry had agreed that he was a member of the laity and that the Pope was above him in authority. So back to politics, and Henry, having imprisoned his brother, was now also the Duke of Normandy, meaning that the main threats to his power were external. The two major threats were Louis VI, the King of France, and Fulk V, the Duke of Anjou. The former Duke Robert had a son, William, who felt that Normandy was rightfully his, and he sought the help of the other lords to retake his birthright. In 1118, with the help of the Count of Flanders, he led a rebellion in Normandy, which saw most of the duchy fall, but it dissipated quickly after the Count of Flanders was injured in a siege. In the next year, Louis VI of France invaded, but Henry led an army against him and the French were defeated at the Battle of Bremule. To finance this war, immense taxes were raised, including the continuation of the Danegeld established under the previous Anglo-Saxon monarchs. Henry was notable for being good with the kingdom's finances, the evaluation of which was done with a checkered piece of cloth called the exchequer. By the way, this is why the modern minister in charge of the economy is called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Henry had just managed to avoid catastrophe in losing Normandy, but his reign was made much more complicated when his son, William, drowned in the English Channel after his ship sank. This left Henry with no legitimate male heirs, only a daughter, Matilda. In 1125, Matilda was left widowed after his husband, the Holy Roman Emperor, died and returned to England, where King Henry appointed her as his heir. Matilda is often referred to as Empress during this period, but after her husband died, she no longer held the title. Henry married her to the son of Count Fulk of Anjou, a man called Geoffrey Plantagenet. Henry soon after fell out with Geoffrey and Matilda, which meant that upon Henry's death in 1135, a succession crisis would break out. So there were two potential heirs for the English throne. The first was of course Geoffrey, who at the time of Henry's death was in Anjou. The other was Henry's nephew, Stephen, the Count of Boulogne. Given Henry's arguments with Geoffrey and Matilda, the English nobles weren't too keen on them, whereas Stephen was very
Is it the Boulogne we know today?
Fortunately for Stephen, he was much closer to England than his rivals, meaning he could act first, which he did. He soon after arrived in London and secured the support of the major lords, and on December the 22nd he was crowned King of England and made Duke of Normandy.
I wish he talked more about how London became increasingly important. I mean, back on the early episodes of Roman Britain, he was talking about Londinium, and then he just forgot about it for like 5 episodes.
Major problems didn't begin for Stephen until 1138, when Robert, the Earl of Gloucester, revolted against him, declaring for Matilda. To make matters worse, Geoffrey, who was now the Count of Anjou since his father had left to become King of Jerusalem, invaded Normandy. At the same time in the north, King David I of Scotland invaded and annexed Carlisle. This period of English history is often referred to as the Anarchy, but in many respects it was more a routine war of succession. There were rebelling lords in areas which English authority was shattered, but ultimately it was no more anarchic than any other civil war previous to this. During the anarchy, Stephen made several errors. The first was allowing Matilda to slip through his grasp after she landed at Arundel here, and met with Earl Robert of Gloucester in Bristol in 1139. His next mistake was at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, in which instead of retreating when the battle was going against him, Stephen continued to fight and ended up getting himself captured and imprisoned. This should have been the end of the Civil War and Stephen's reign, but that would have required the other side to not make mistakes also, which they did. Matilda entered London and swiftly offended everyone there and was chased out shortly before her planned coronation. Soon after that, Earl Robert was captured and Matilda agreed to swap prisoners, Robert for Stephen, which meant the Civil War would continue. Geoffrey conquered Normandy in 1144, whereas in England no headway was made in the Civil War until Earl Robert died in 1147 and Matilda, realising it was over, left the year afterwards. In 1150, Geoffrey made he and Matilda's son, Henry, the Duke of Normandy, and Geoffrey himself died a year later, meaning Henry also became the Count of Anjou as well. In 1152, King Louis VII divorced his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who roughly 11 seconds later married Henry, giving him Aquitaine as well and control of all of this territory. In a daring act, Henry sailed to England to negotiate the succession. Stephen's heir had died, so it was agreed that Stephen would remain king, but Henry would succeed him. Thus peace was finally secured in England. Henry wouldn't have to wait long, since Stephen would die in 1154 and Henry would succeed him as Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet dynasty and the man who ruled over all of this land.
The Henrys are coming, bro.
Thank you for watching.
Okay, so episode 10. God damn, these are really good, man. Very interesting. There's no books right now. I just want to do some research. Wessex. Like I said, a current region. Oh, it was. It's not a region anymore. Yeah. So Essex, is that? I'm sorry, guys. Yeah, it is a county of England, north of London. Okay, cool. Cool. Well, let's go for episode 10. The Angevin Empire and Richard the Lionheart. King John. Okay. What's the last episode? I want to know that. The Cold War. English history. There we go. Bam. The last episode is the English Civil War. Huh. Okay, well, I'm not going to spoil it.
1154 and Henry II has become King of England. Unlike most of his predecessors, his succession didn't lead to a prolonged civil war, which was a nice change of pace. Henry II was not just the King of England, he was also the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou and the Duke of Aquitaine.
Oh.
This meant that alongside all of those titles, he ruled all of this territory, making him the most powerful ruler in all of Europe. The large domains which he held were both a strength and a weakness. Henry was unsurprisingly extremely wealthy since he was able to tax the export of goods made in his French holdings such as wine and salt, and also had the largest taxable population in Europe. The weakness of all this territory was that he made enemies with the King of France and the other French nobles who felt that Henry was far too powerful. To put this into perspective, these were the borders of medieval France, and these were the parts of said kingdom which swore their allegiance to Henry and not the French King Louis VII. Shockingly, this arrangement was not popular with Louis. Henry attempted to stabilise the English kingdom after the turmoil of the Civil War during his predecessor's reign. He first managed to intimidate Scotland's King Malcolm IV to give back the territory Scotland had previously seized. Throughout the next decade, Henry found himself involved much more in the squabbles of his French neighbours. In fact, Henry spent the majority of his reign in his French holdings, which were centred at Chinon, here. This is important in highlighting that the Plantagenets should not be seen as English kings with French holdings, but as French nobles who were also the kings of England. Henry managed to expand his territory to this, with the most notable gain being the Duchy of Brittany in 1166.
Yeah, Brittany.
Henry also managed to force the submission of Toulouse briefly in the following decade, but it didn't last. Henry's relationship with the rest of France did not improve, and in 1167 he banned English monks from learning at the University of Paris, which led to the rapid growth of Oxford as a major site of learning. So Henry had three major issues moving forward. The first was the relationship between the crown and the church, the second was the conquest of Ireland, and the third was by far his greatest problem, the succession. Henry's issues with the church revolved mostly around one man, Thomas Becket, whom Henry was close friends with.
Like, if you really think about it, how many wars in Europe were fought because of a succession issue? The ones that come to mind are the Austrian succession and the Spanish succession. So
Archbishop
that
of Canterbury
seems like
in
it's always an
1162.
issue.
Henry had hoped that by appointing a friend, his issues with the church would be glossed over. Unfortunately for Henry, Thomas was a principled man and almost immediately began berating the king for his violations of church rights. One of the main issues was surrounding ecclesiastical courts, which were courts the church used to judge the clergy, since according to church doctrine, secular courts were not fit to judge holy men. This annoyed Henry, since 1. There were criminals in his kingdom who didn't have to answer to him, and 2. Secular courts would often punish people by seizing property, thus giving the king more revenue, which he liked. Becket defied the king's wish to try men of the church, and in 1164 Henry put Becket on trial for trumped up charges, which were essentially, you don't like the king, so you have to go. Becket was found guilty and fled to the continent, leaving the king to do whatever he wanted. In 1169, Henry turned his attention to the conquest of Ireland. Henry had been considering this since 1155 when he received permission to do so from Pope Hadrian IV, the only English pope ever. The authenticity of this permission is disputed, and some
there was an English pope. I didn't know that. That's pretty cool.
believe Henry made it up as a convenient excuse to conquer. Irrespective of the authenticity of this permission, Henry got to conquering. The first people to go to Ireland were mercenaries who were helping a deposed Irish king, though in 1170 some of Henry's nobles went over, most notably Richard de Clare, and managed to swiftly conquer this area. Henry at this point was also dealing with his third problem, what to do about the succession. In 1169 his eldest son, also called Henry, was coronated as king alongside his father. Henry the young king, as he's known, did not hold any real power, it simply made it clear that he was the undisputed heir. Thomas Becket, still in exile, was unhappy that the Archbishop of Canterbury's right to crown kings had been sidestepped.
Oh, this is an interesting one. Wasn't there a Habsburg who became Emperor of Mexico for a short time before being executed? Yes, there was. He was an Austrian Habsburg called Maximilian. And basically, when America, the USA, fought a civil war, the North against the South, the French thought it'd be kind of cool to invade Mexico because Mexico at the time was very weak, so they did. And they used an Austrian Habsburg, Maximilian, I think it was like Maximilian II. They invaded Mexico, put him on the throne, and the cool thing is that Maximilian was actually like kind of a liberal guy, because the only people in Mexico who supported the French monarchy in Mexico were the conservatives. But Maximilian, it's very interesting because he actually sort of cared about the Mexican people. He wanted to be liked by the Mexican people. He actually was sent to Mexico with the idea that, the Mexican people want me there, but the French lied to him, telling him, the Mexican people, they totally want you ruling over there. And when they executed him, he said something like, Viva la Revolución, Viva the Revolution, and God bless Mexico, something like that. He said something like that when he was executed. So In Mexico, he's sort of seemed like as a very neutral figure. Like, yeah, he was a Habsburg that dominated Mexico for like 6 years with the French, but at the same time, he sort of cared a little bit about the Mexican people. So yeah, it's a very interesting. The second, it's called the second French intervention in Mexico, and it's one of a few times that Mexico was invaded by a foreign power. So yeah, it's interesting. Flower garden seems funny. I'm not entirely sure what that means.
It was, however, negotiated by the Pope that Becket could return, which he did, and he quickly went back to annoying the king. By 1170, Henry was frankly fed up with Becket, and in a rage he said something along the lines of, "Will nobody rid me of this meddlesome priest?" This was understood by some knights as a request to murder him. These knights travelled to England, and on December the 29th, 1170, Becket was stabbed to death inside Canterbury Cathedral. This murder shocked the Christian world and pretty much ruined Henry's reputation, since murdering archbishops is mostly frowned upon. Becket was swiftly declared a saint, but from a practical perspective, this did make Henry's job a lot easier. So allegedly, Henry was concerned that Richard the Clare was about to declare himself the king of an independent Irish kingdom, and so in 1171 he landed there with a large force to keep things in check. By the time Henry left Ireland the next year, his hold over it looked like this, with those that ruled the remainder having pledged loyalty to him. This marks the beginning of sustained English and later British intervention in Ireland, which still continues to this day. This meant that Henry's domain at its height looked like this, with these areas from Scotland to Toulouse pledging their loyalty to him. These lands are often collectively referred to as the Angevin Empire. Side note on the name, the word Angevin comes from Anjou, the duchy the Plantagenets originally held. The word empire is more difficult since it is a modern term and was not used at the time to describe the Angevin lands. Henry II, despite being the wealthiest and most powerful monarch...
Shit. Okay, give me 5 minutes. Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. Whiskey's a diuretic, okay? I have to go to the bathroom again. But it's gonna be like 1 minute. There we go. We were at Emperor Henry.
In Europe at the time did not and would not have referred to himself as emperor. The reasons for this are clad in complex theology, but there could only be one real emperor, and that was the Holy Roman Emperor. So the conquest of Ireland fed into the
Holy Roman
continuing
Empire,
problems surrounding the succession. The problem with being a king is that your sons often can't wait for you to die so they can take your stuff, and Henry's sons were no different. Henry's domain simply wouldn't pass from father to eldest son, but was supposed to be portioned out between them to stop them from fighting. Henry the young king was to get Anjou, Normandy and England. Henry's second son, Richard, was to get Aquitaine. Geoffrey was to get Brittany, and Henry's youngest, John, was to get Ireland. Unsurprisingly, literally none of his sons were happy about this, except John, who was only 8. Henry's restless sons found help from the King of France, who was more than happy to do anything that would undermine Angevin power. In 1173, Henry's sons would enter open rebellion against him. Henry the Young King...
We actually got to 7 viewers, so that's actually pretty cool.
...was sick of not having any real power and wanted more money. Richard and Geoffrey wanted more land than Henry had promised, and John was still busy being 8. The 3 sons teamed up with the King of France, the King of Scotland, the Count of Flanders, and also Henry's wife, Queen Eleanor, in invading the Angevin territories. They all launched invasions at roughly the same time and all of them were defeated. Rebellions and civil war continued into the next year, but none were even remotely successful and Henry's sons all surrendered. A series of deaths in the 1180s changed Henry's situation dramatically. In 1180, King Louis VII of France died and was succeeded by Philip Augustus, who was obsessed with retaking French lands. In 1183, Henry the Young King died, and in 1186, the third son, Geoffrey, died as well, leaving only Richard and John as heirs. Richard was concerned that his previous rebellions would give his father an excuse to pick John instead, and so did the only thing he could think of, rebel again. He did this in 1189 with the help of Philip Augustus, who together invaded and quickly pushed back the armies of the now dying Henry II. Henry surrendered to both Richard and Philippe and died shortly afterwards in Anjou. After his father's death, Richard took up his French titles and went to England, and on the 3rd of September he was crowned King Richard I. So Richard's reign is famous for one thing above all, his crusade, which is where he earned his famous epithet, Richard the Lionheart. So Richard had already agreed to go on a crusade in 1187, which was called in response to the fall of Jerusalem. King Philip Augustus of France had also agreed to go on this crusade, and it's important to know that those who went crusading were under special protection by the Pope. If a person took the cross, the term used for those who went on a crusade, their lands were supposed to be left alone, and it was illegal, in theory, to capture or harm those on their way to or from the Holy Lands. As will become evident, this did not always happen. Richard raised taxes, ransomed the King of Scotland, and sold titles and positions in government called offices to raise revenue for his Crusader army. In 1190, he departed for the Holy Land, stopping off at Sicily on the way, where he found his sister, Joan, imprisoned. There was some fighting and pillaging, but after being paid off, Richard freed his sister and moved on. Before his fleet could get to the Holy Land, it was dispersed by a storm, and Richard ended up at Cyprus. There was some conflict with its ruler, a Byzantine prince called Isaac Komnenos, and Richard peacefully negotiated a settlement. Just kidding, instead he conquered the island and threw Isaac into prison. Later that year, Richard arrived in Acre, here, and soon after sold Cyprus to the Knights Templar because money. Whilst they were there, Richard and Philip Augustus fell out and Philippe returned to France. Richard was unable to retake Jerusalem, but he won some major victories against his famous rival Saladin. In the end, Richard signed a treaty with Saladin which secured the remaining Crusader states of Antioch and Tripoli and importantly granted safe passage to the Christians in the Holy Land. So back in Richard's domains there had been several revolts, the most notable being by his brother John. Nothing came of these rebellions due mostly to the good leadership of the men Richard had entrusted with his kingdom, namely William de Longchamp and Hugh de Puiset. These men were appointed as joint justiciars, which essentially meant that they acted with the king's authority whilst he was away. This does not mean that there were no issues in England during Richard's time crusading. In 1190 there was a massacre of Jews throughout the country, notably at York, and it was later declared that Jews could not make any transactions without it being documented by the crown.
Oh, damn.
Richard began his journey back from the Holy Land in 1192. On the way he was captured near Vienna and was imprisoned by the Duke of Austria, Leopold V, who was swiftly excommunicated, that is, expelled from the Christian faith by the Pope for this. Richard was handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor and was ransomed in early 1194. Richard's time in prison proved costly, first in terms of money since his ransom was cripplingly expensive, being the equivalent of over 2 years' worth of taxes raised in England.
Oh my God.
The other way it was costly was instability for his kingdom. During his imprisonment, John kept rebelling and Philip Augustus of France made military incursions, but he made little gains. Richard returned to England, forgave his brother for his rebellions and made him his heir since Richard had no sons. Richard would then spend the next 5 years of his reign retaking the lost territories. Richard also took the motto Dieu est mon droit, which means God and my right. Richard also appointed a man called Hubert Walter as Archbishop of Canterbury, who ruled England effectively in Richard's name. Walter was able to raise the massive taxes needed for Richard's ransom, as well as those needed for his war against Philippe. Walter also managed to suppress rebellions and negotiate with the neighbouring kings to prevent invasions. In 1199, whilst he was suppressing a revolt, Richard was injured by a loose crossbow bolt and soon after died of his wounds, thus leaving the way open for John, one of the most notorious kings in English history. Ultimately, Richard's legacy is a complex one. He is often seen as a paragon of Christian chivalry, but it's important to remember that whilst he was the embodiment of a holy crusader, he was also a rebel and one whose kingdom was in many respects little more than a revenue pot for his warring. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some book recommendations in the description if you'd like to know.
Next episode is the Magna Carta, which it's definitely pretty cool. And a lot of the late, quote unquote, like old history, English history, I think I know a little bit more. Like, for example, the War of the Roses. A lot of the old ones, like the English Civil War. It's definitely going to be very interesting. But I think this live stream is already long. I'm sure, like, you guys in England, especially you, Thomas, it's very late over there. And I think, 2 hours is, like, the perfect length for a live stream video. So, thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate it. Even if it's just like a few viewers, I always appreciate you guys coming here and having like a chat about history and whatever. I had a really fun time. I appreciate you guys coming. You can always support the channel by subscribing, giving it a like, and most importantly, checking my links on Skillshare. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next live stream.